Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Sometimes the most tragic stories begin with the most ordinary moments. This is the story of Nadine Lott, a 30-year-old woman whose life was brutally cut short on a cold December night in Ireland. It's a story that speaks to the devastating reality of domestic violence, the warning signs that too often go unheeded, and a family's fight for justice in the face of unimaginable loss. While Nadine's story isn't just about how she died, it's about how she lived, the dream she held, and the daughter she adored. Tonight we'll walk through the events that led to that fateful December evening in 2019, in the quiet seaside town of Arklow, County Wicklow. Nadine Lott was the kind of person who lit up the room she entered. Those who knew her described her as vibrant, caring, and endlessly devoted to her 6-year-old daughter. She had built a successful career as a beautician, a profession that suited her nurturing personality and her desire to help people feel their best. Living in Arklow, a picturesque coastal town south of Dublin, Nadine had created what seemed like an ideal life. She had her own apartment on St. Mary's Road, a thriving business, and most importantly, her beloved daughter by her side. Her family was close-knit. Her mother Claire and her sisters were not just relatives, but her dearest friends. They spoke regularly, shared everything, and supported each other through life's ups and downs. Nadine viewed her daughter as her greatest achievement, often telling friends that the little girl was not just her child, but her best friend. The love between them was evident to everyone who saw them together. Nadine was determined to give her daughter everything she had never had: stability, security, and unconditional love. Her career as a beautician wasn't just a job. It was a calling. Nadine had a gift for making people feel beautiful, both inside and out. Her clients weren't just customers. They were friends who trusted her with their deepest insecurities and celebrated their triumphs with her. She had worked hard to build her reputation, and by 2019 she was well established in her field with a loyal clientele who adored her. Those who knew Nadine described her as someone who always saw the best in people, sometimes to her own detriment. She was generous with her time, her energy, and her heart. She believed in second chances, in the power of love to heal, and in the possibility that people could change. These beautiful qualities that made her such a beloved friend and devoted mother would, tragically, also make her vulnerable to someone who would exploit her kindness. In 2012, Nadine's life took what seemed like an exciting turn. As a young beautician looking to broaden her horizons, she decided to work abroad in Darwin, Australia. It was a common path for many Irish professionals, a chance to experience life in a different country while building skills and saving money. For Nadine, it represented adventure and opportunity. It was in Darwin that Nadine first encountered Daniel Martag. Later, prosecutors would describe this meeting as Nadine's dreadful misfortune, but at the time it probably felt like fate. Martag was charming, attentive, and seemed to offer the kind of romance that young women dream about. He was also a trained boxer, physically imposing but initially presenting himself as protective rather than threatening. Their relationship began like many others, with passion, promises, and what seemed like genuine affection. But even in those early days in Australia, there were signs that those closest to Nadine would later recognize as red flags. Martag's possessiveness could be intense. His jealousy could flare unexpectedly. His mood swings, which he often attributed to stress or external factors, created an atmosphere of walking on eggshells. When their time in Australia came to an end, Nadine returned to Ireland with Martag in tow. She was ready to build a life together, to introduce him to her family, and to see where their relationship might lead. What she couldn't have known was that she was bringing home a man whose capacity for violence would eventually destroy not just her own life, but the lives of everyone who loved her. Back in Ireland, their relationship continued, but the dynamics that had begun in Australia only intensified. The isolation that Murtagh had been able to maintain over Nadine, while they were far from her family and friends, became harder to sustain. Nadine's close relationships with her mother and sisters, her established life and career, and her independence all became sources of friction. For several years, Nadine tried to make the relationship work. She, like many women in similar situations, believed that love could conquer the problems they faced. She made excuses for his behavior, minimized the incidents that concerned her family, and held on to hope that things would improve. But patterns of control and manipulation are not easily broken, and Murtagh's behavior became increasingly erratic and concerning. By 2019, Nadine and Daniel Murtagh were no longer together, but their separation was far from clean or final. Murtagh, who lived in Bon at Clondalkin in Dublin, maintained contact with Nadine through text messages and occasional visits. These communications would later reveal a disturbing pattern of manipulation, veiled threats, and emotional abuse. The text messages that emerged during the subsequent investigation painted a picture of a man unable to accept the end of his relationship and a woman trying desperately to maintain boundaries while avoiding confrontation. Murtagh's messages often carried an undertone of menace wrapped in expressions of concern, and one particularly chilling exchange that would later be presented in court. Murtagh sent Nadine a message saying, "Nadine, I worry about ye, not in love. Just don't slip." When Nadine questioned what he meant by threatening her, she responded with remarkable clarity, "Just don't slip sounds a bit like a threat." These messages reveal something crucial about Nadine's situation in the months leading up to her death. She was not naive about the danger that Murtagh potentially represented. She could see through his veiled language and recognized his attempts at intimidation for what they were. But like many victims of domestic violence, she was trapped in a complex web of fear, hope, and practical concerns. Nadine had her daughter to consider. She had a life to maintain, a business to run, and a community where she was known and respected. The idea of upending everything, of living in constant fear, or of admitting to her family the full extent of what she was dealing with, was overwhelming. So she tried to manage the situation, to keep Murtagh at arm's length, while avoiding the kind of confrontation that might escalate his behavior. Her family and friends could see that something was troubling her, but Nadine, like many women in her situation, had become expert at minimizing and hiding the reality of what she was facing. She didn't want to worry them, didn't want to admit that her judgment about Murtagh had been so wrong, and perhaps still held on to some hope that he would eventually accept their breakup and move on. Saturday, December 14th, 2019. Began like many other days for Nadine. She was at home in her apartment on St. Mary's Road in Arklow, probably making plans for the approaching Christmas holiday. Her daughter was the center of her world, and she would have been thinking about gifts, celebrations, and the joy of spending the holidays with her extended family. What brought Daniel Murtagh to Arklow that day remains part of the tragedy's mystery. Did Nadine know he was coming? Was this a planned visit that went horribly wrong, or was this an unwelcome surprise? The investigation would later reveal that Murtagh had prepared for what was to come in a way that suggests premeditation rather than a spontaneous loss of control. Before arriving at Nadine's apartment, Murtagh had consumed a dangerous combination of substances. He had smoked marijuana, taken 2 pills, and drunk what he described as a daddy naggin, a shoulder of Captain Morgan rum, straight from the bottle. This wasn't casual recreational use. This was someone deliberately altering his mental state before confronting the woman who had tried to end their relationship. When Murtagh arrived at Nadine's apartment, neighbors later reported hearing sounds that suggested something was wrong. But in a residential building, it can be difficult to distinguish between normal household noises and something more sinister. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it was too late to prevent the tragedy that was unfolding behind Nadine's front door. What happened in that apartment over the next several hours represents one of the most brutal domestic violence attacks ever prosecuted in Irish courts. Murtagh, with his training as a boxer and his superior physical strength, subjected Nadine to what prosecutors would later describe as a sustained and violent attack. Using only his bare hands, he inflicted blunt force trauma so severe that it would ultimately prove fatal. The injuries Nadine sustained were described by medical experts as extreme and grotesque. The force of the attack separated flesh from bone on her face. The beating was so severe that when her family later saw her, she was completely unrecognizable. This wasn't a momentary loss of control. This was a sustained, brutal assault that continued long after any rational person would have stopped. In the early hours of December 15th, around 4:25 a.m., a neighbor named Amela Kolenovich made a frantic call to emergency services. Something was terribly wrong in the apartment next to hers. She could hear sounds that suggested someone was in serious trouble, and she had the courage to act when action was desperately needed. When Kolenovich called the police, she reported that her neighbor Nadine Lott needed urgent help. In the confusion and stress of the moment, she initially believed that Nadine had been stabbed, but the reality was far worse. The injuries that Nadine had sustained from the hours-long beating were so severe that even from a distance, even in the poor lighting of an early winter morning, it was clear that this was a life-threatening emergency. When emergency responders arrived at the apartment on St. Mary's Road, they were confronted with a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. The apartment showed signs of a violent struggle. There was blood evidence that spoke to the sustained nature of the attack, and there was Nadine, barely clinging to life, her injuries so severe that she was struggling to breathe. The paramedics and police officers who responded that morning worked frantically to save Nadine's life. They stabilized her as best they could and rushed her to the hospital, but the extent of her injuries was immediately apparent. The trauma she had suffered was not something that could be easily repaired. The damage to her face, her skull, and her brain was extensive and devastating. Daniel Murtagh was found at the scene, still in the apartment where he had carried out his brutal attack. He was arrested immediately, but the legal process that would follow would be lengthy, complex, and emotionally devastating for everyone involved. At that moment, however, the priority was getting Nadine the medical care she desperately needed, and beginning the investigation that would eventually bring her attacker to justice. As news of the attack spread through Arklow and reached Nadine's family, a nightmare began for all those who loved her. Her mother, Claire, her sisters, and her extended family rushed to the hospital, not yet knowing the full extent of what had happened, but understanding that their beloved Nadine was fighting for her life. Nadine was rushed to St. Vincent's University Hospital in Dublin, where the medical team worked around the clock to save her life. The injuries she had sustained were unlike anything most of the medical professionals had encountered in their careers. The blunt force trauma to her head and face was so severe that it had caused massive swelling, bleeding, and damage to crucial structures. For 3 agonizing days, Nadine's family maintained a vigil at her bedside. Her mother, Claire, who had given birth to this vibrant, loving woman 30 years earlier, now faced the unthinkable reality that her daughter might not survive the injuries inflicted by someone who had once claimed to love her. The medical team fought to save Nadine's life, but the extent of her injuries made recovery increasingly unlikely. The trauma to her brain was severe, and despite the best efforts of skilled surgeons and intensive care specialists, Nadine's condition continued to deteriorate. During those 3 days, Nadine's family experienced a hell that no family should ever have to endure. They watched the woman they loved lying unconscious, connected to machines, her face so damaged by the attack that they could barely recognize her. The vibrant, beautiful woman who had been the center of their world was fighting a battle that she was unlikely to win. Her 6-year-old daughter, who saw Nadine as her best friend and greatest protector, was now facing the unimaginable prospect of losing her mother. The family had to grapple not just with their own grief and shock, but with how to explain to a child that the person she loved most in the world might not be coming home. On December 17th, 2019, 3 days after the attack, Nadine Lott succumbed to her injuries. The woman who had dedicated her life to making others feel beautiful, who had built a successful career through hard work and determination, who had loved her daughter with every fiber of her being, was gone. The injuries inflicted by Daniel Murtagh had proven too severe for even the most advanced medical care to overcome. With Nadine's death, what had begun as an investigation into a serious assault became a murder investigation. Daniel Murtagh, who had been in custody since the attack, now faced the most serious charge in the Irish legal system. The Gardaí, Ireland's police force, began building a case that would seek to hold him accountable for the destruction of a life, a family, and a future. The investigation revealed a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond the night of December 14th. The text messages between Murtagh and Nadine, which painted a picture of ongoing harassment and veiled threats, became crucial evidence. The physical evidence from the apartment told the story of a sustained and brutal attack, The testimony of neighbors, medical professionals, and family members would all contribute to understanding what had happened and why. For Nadine's family, the legal process that followed was both necessary and unbearably painful. They wanted justice for their beloved daughter and sister, but pursuing that justice meant reliving the horror of her final hours again and again. Every court appearance, every piece of evidence presented, every detail discussed in legal proceedings was a reminder of what they had lost and how brutally it had been taken from them. The case took time to come to trial, as murder cases do. During that period, Nadine's family had to live with their grief while knowing that the man responsible for their daughter's death was alive, in custody, but not yet held accountable. They had to watch as lawyers prepared arguments, as evidence was analyzed, and as the legal system slowly worked toward what they hoped would be justice. Throughout this period, Nadine's memory lived on, in the hearts of all who had known her. Her daughter, now growing up without her mother, was surrounded by family members who were determined to ensure that she knew how much her mother had loved her. The community in Arklow mourned the loss of a woman who had been a positive presence in their town, and Nadine's colleagues in the beauty industry remembered a professional who had brought joy and confidence to her clients. When Daniel Murtagh's trial finally began in 2021, it brought both hope for justice and the painful necessity of examining every detail of Nadine's final hours. The Central Criminal Court in Dublin became the venue where Murtagh would face the consequences of his actions, and where Nadine's family would finally have the opportunity to see him held accountable. Murtagh's legal strategy was predictable, but deeply offensive to those who had loved Nadine. He pleaded not guilty to murder, instead pleading guilty only to manslaughter. His defense was based on the claim that he had been too intoxicated on the night of the attack to form the intent necessary for a murder conviction. According to his lawyers, the combination of alcohol and drugs he had consumed before attacking Nadine had impaired his judgment to such a degree that he could not be held responsible for intending her death. This defense strategy was not unusual in cases involving domestic violence homicides, but it was particularly galling to Nadine's family. The suggestion that Murtagh's voluntary consumption of substances somehow lessened his responsibility for the brutal attack he carried out was deeply insulting to their memory of Nadine and their understanding of what had happened that night. The prosecution, led by experienced criminal barristers, painted a very different picture. They argued that Murtagh's actions were deliberate, sustained, and carried out with the clear intent to cause serious harm or death. They pointed to the severity of the beating, which continued long after Nadine would have been unable to defend herself. They emphasized the pattern of threatening behavior that had preceded the attack, suggesting that this was not a spontaneous outburst, but the culmination of months of escalating violence. As the trial proceeded, the courtroom heard evidence that was difficult for everyone present to bear. Medical testimony described the extent of Nadine's injuries in clinical detail, making clear that the force required to inflict such damage was enormous, and that the attack had been sustained over a significant period of time. The suggestion that someone could inflict such injuries without intending to cause death or serious harm was, the prosecution argued, simply not credible. The evidence presented during the trial painted a comprehensive picture of the relationship between Nadine and Murtagh and the events of December 14th. Text messages between the two were read aloud in court, revealing the threatening undertone of much of Murtagh's communication and Nadine's clear recognition that she was being intimidated. Medical experts testified about the nature and extent of Nadine's injuries. Dr. Linda Mulligan, the state pathologist, provided testimony that was both crucial to the prosecution's case and heartbreaking for Nadine's family to hear. She described injuries that were extreme and grotesque, explaining how the blunt force trauma had caused massive damage to Nadine's face and skull. The level of force required to cause such injuries, she testified, was consistent with repeated, forceful blows from someone with significant physical strength. The pathologist's testimony made clear that these were not injuries that could have been inflicted accidentally or in a brief moment of altered consciousness. The pattern of damage suggested a sustained attack in which the perpetrator continued to inflict blows long after the victim would have been unable to defend herself or pose any threat. Neighbors testified about what they had heard on the night of the attack. While they hadn't immediately recognized the sounds as evidence of violence, a common issue in domestic violence cases, their testimony helped establish the timeline and duration of the assault. The fact that the attack continued for hours rather than minutes was significant evidence against Murtagh's claim that he had been too intoxicated to understand what he was doing. Perhaps most powerfully, Nadine's family members testified about the impact of her death on their lives. Her mother Claire spoke about the daughter she had raised, the woman she had watched build a successful career and devoted herself to motherhood, and the devastating loss that had torn their family apart. The testimony of family members served not only to establish the human cost of Murtagh's actions, but also to ensure that Nadine was remembered as more than just a victim. She was a person with hopes, dreams, and people who loved her deeply. Daniel Murtagh's defense team faced the challenging task of arguing that their client, while admittedly responsible for Nadine's death, had not committed murder. Their argument centered on the concept of diminished responsibility due to voluntary intoxication, a legal defense that has been used in various forms in many jurisdictions but remains controversial, particularly in domestic violence cases. The defense argued that Murtagh's consumption of alcohol and drugs before the attack had so impaired his cognitive functioning that he could not form the specific intent required for a murder conviction. They presented evidence about his substance use that night, including his own admissions to Gardaí about smoking cannabis, taking pills, and consuming a significant amount of rum straight from the bottle. However, the defense faced significant challenges in making this argument convincing. The prosecution effectively countered by pointing out that voluntary intoxication is generally not accepted as a defense for serious crimes, particularly when the defendant chose to consume the substances in question. Moreover, the sustained nature of the attack, continuing over hours rather than minutes, suggested a level of purposeful behavior that was difficult to reconcile with the claim of severe impairment. The defense also had to contend with evidence about Murtagh's behavior in the months leading up to the attack. The pattern of threatening communication with Nadine, his inability to accept the end of their relationship, and his decision to travel from Dublin to Arklow that night all suggested a level of planning and intent that contradicted claims of impaired judgment. Perhaps most damaging to the defense's argument was the sheer brutality of the attack itself. The level of force required to inflict the injuries that killed Nadine, applied repeatedly over an extended period, was difficult to explain as the actions of someone who was not aware of what he was doing. The prosecution argued, and medical evidence supported, that this was not the behavior of someone acting without intent, but rather someone who was determined to cause serious harm. After hearing all the evidence, the 12 members of the jury retired to consider their verdict. They deliberated for 5 hours and 46 minutes over 2 days, carefully weighing the arguments presented by both the prosecution and the defense. The question they had to answer was whether Daniel Murtagh had murdered Nadine Lott, or whether his voluntary intoxication reduced his culpability to manslaughter. On August 5, 2021, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of murder. The rejection of Murtagh's defense was decisive and clear. The jury had concluded that despite his claims of intoxication, Murtagh had acted with the intent to kill or cause serious bodily harm to Nadine Lott, and that his voluntary consumption of substances did not excuse or diminish his responsibility for her death. For Nadine's family, the verdict represented a form of justice, though nothing could truly compensate for their loss. Her mother Claire, her sisters, and her extended family had endured nearly 2 years of legal proceedings, during which they had been forced to relive the trauma of Nadine's death repeatedly. The guilty verdict meant that Murtagh would be held fully accountable for his actions and would face the maximum penalty under Irish law. The verdict also sent an important message about how the Irish legal system views domestic violence and the defenses often raised in such cases. The jury's rejection of the diminished responsibility argument made clear that voluntary intoxication would not be accepted as an excuse for the brutal murder of a former partner, regardless of the perpetrator's claims about his mental state at the time of the attack. Following the verdict, Murtagh was remanded in custody to await sentencing. Under Irish law, a murder conviction carries a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment, though the actual time served can vary based on various factors. For Nadine's family, knowing that Murtagh would spend the rest of his life behind bars provided some measure of closure, though it could never undo the damage he had done to their lives. On October 4, 2021, Daniel Murtagh returned to the Central Criminal Court in Dublin for sentencing. As expected, he received the mandatory sentence of life imprisonment for the murder of Nadine Lott. But the sentencing hearing was about more than just the legal formalities. It was an opportunity for Nadine's family to speak directly about the impact of her death, and to ensure that her memory was honored. The victim impact statements delivered that day were powerful testimonies to the woman Nadine had been, and the devastation her loss had caused. Her mother Claire spoke about the overwhelming grief that had consumed their family since Nadine's death. She described the challenge of trying to explain to Nadine's young daughter why her mother would never be coming home, and the impossible task of filling the void left by someone who had been the center of so many lives. Claire Lott's statement was particularly poignant in its description of what the family had endured during the trial process. She spoke about how the legal proceedings had seemed to focus more on Murtagh and his circumstances than on Nadine and what she had suffered. From the minute the trial started until it was over, it was all about him, she said, expressing the frustration that many families feel when the criminal justice system seems to prioritize the rights of defendants over the memory of victims. The family's statements also emphasized Nadine's role as a mother and the devastating impact her death had on her young daughter. A 6-year-old child had lost the person she considered her best friend, her greatest protector, and her primary source of love and security. The long-term effects of this loss on the child were impossible to quantify, but they would undoubtedly shape her life in ways that were heartbreaking to contemplate. In their statements, the family made clear that while they welcomed Murtagh's conviction and life sentence, no legal outcome could truly constitute justice for what had been done to Nadine. As they put it, the sentence can never bring true justice for Nadine. The only thing that could have provided justice would have been Nadine's continued life, her ability to raise her daughter, and her opportunity to fulfill the dreams and plans that Murtagh had brutally destroyed. Nadine Lott's murder was tragically not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of domestic violence that affects women across Ireland and around the world. Her death became a focal point for discussions about how society, law enforcement, and the legal system respond to domestic violence, and what more can be done to protect vulnerable individuals. Women's organizations in Ireland, including Women's Aid, used Nadine's case to call for systemic changes in how domestic violence cases are handled. They advocated for the introduction of domestic homicide reviews, comprehensive examinations of cases like Nadine's, to identify missed opportunities for intervention and to develop better practices for protecting victims of domestic abuse. The case highlighted several issues that are common in domestic violence situations. The pattern of escalating control and threats that Nadine experienced is typical of abusive relationships. Her attempts to maintain boundaries while avoiding confrontation reflected the impossible position that many victims find themselves in, trying to manage a dangerous situation while maintaining some semblance of normal life. Nadine's story also illustrated the particular challenges faced by women who are trying to leave abusive relationships. Statistics consistently show that the period during and immediately after leaving an abusive partner is the most dangerous time for victims of domestic violence. Murtagh's inability to accept the end of his relationship with Nadine and his escalating threatening behavior fit this pattern perfectly. The case raised questions about whether there were missed opportunities for intervention before Nadine's death. Had the threatening text messages been reported to police? Were there warning signs that friends, family, or professionals might have recognized and acted upon? These questions are important not to assign blame, but to identify ways that future tragedies might be prevented. In the aftermath of the trial and sentencing, Nadine's family focused on ensuring that her memory would be preserved and honored. They were determined that she would be remembered, not just as a victim of domestic violence, but as the vibrant, loving, successful woman she had been throughout her 30 years of life. Nadine's career as a beautician was more than just a job. It was a calling that reflected her desire to help others feel confident and beautiful. Her clients remembered her not just for her professional skills, but for her kindness, her genuine interest in their lives, and her ability to make everyone feel special. In the beauty industry, where relationships between professionals and clients can be deeply personal, Nadine had built a reputation based on trust, skill, and genuine care for others. Her role as a mother was perhaps the most defining aspect of her identity. Those who knew Nadine spoke consistently about how much she adored her daughter and how devoted she was to providing the best possible life for her child. The little girl was not just Nadine's daughter, but her best friend, her greatest source of joy, and her primary motivation for all her hard work and ambition. Nadine's relationships with her family members were characterized by deep love and mutual support. Her mother Claire and her sisters were not just relatives, but close friends who shared everything with each other. The family had created a network of love and support that had sustained them through various challenges over the years, but which was now tested by the ultimate tragedy. The community in Arklow remembered Nadine as someone who had contributed positively to their town. She had been a successful business owner, a caring neighbor, and a person who brought light and warmth to the lives of those around her. Her death was not just a loss for her family, but for an entire community that had been enriched by her presence. In the years since Nadine's death, her case has continued to influence discussions about domestic violence prevention and response in Ireland. Advocates have used her story to push for legislative changes, improve training for law enforcement, and better support services for victims of domestic abuse. One of the key areas of focus has been the need for domestic homicide reviews in Ireland. These comprehensive examinations of cases where domestic violence has resulted in death are designed to identify systemic failures, missed opportunities for intervention, and areas where improvements can be made. While such reviews are common in other countries, Ireland has been slower to implement them systematically. The case has also contributed to broader discussions about how the criminal justice system handles domestic violence cases. The defense strategy used by Murtagh, claiming diminished responsibility due to voluntary intoxication, is not uncommon in domestic homicide cases. The jury's decisive rejection of this defense in Nadine's case has been seen as an important precedent, but advocates argue that more work needs to be done to ensure that such defenses are not successful in similar cases. Education and awareness campaigns have also been influenced by cases like Nadine's. The pattern of escalating threats and control that she experienced is now used as an example in training programs for police officers, social workers, and other professionals who might encounter victims of domestic violence. The goal is to help these professionals recognize warning signs and intervene before situations escalate to violence. Support services for victims of domestic violence have also evolved in response to cases like Nadine's. There is greater recognition of the complex challenges faced by victims who are trying to leave abusive relationships, and more resources are being devoted to providing practical and emotional support during this dangerous transition period. Years after her death, Nadine Lott's story continues to resonate with people across Ireland and beyond. Her case has become a symbol of both the devastating impact of domestic violence and the possibility of achieving justice even in the most tragic circumstances. For her family, the passage of time has brought both healing and ongoing grief. They have had to learn to live with the reality that Nadine will never walk through their doors again, never share in family celebrations, and never see her daughter grow up. But they have also worked to ensure that her memory remains alive and that her death serves some purpose in protecting other women from similar fates. Nadine's daughter, now growing older without her mother, has been surrounded by family members who are determined to keep Nadine's memory alive for her. They share stories about the mother she lost too young, show her pictures and videos that capture Nadine's vibrant personality, and work to ensure that she understands how much her mother loved her. The child's resilience in the face of such a profound loss has been both inspiring and heartbreaking for all who know her. Daniel Murtagh remains in prison, where he will likely spend the rest of his life. In 2024, he withdrew his appeal of the murder conviction, finally accepting legal responsibility for his actions. For Nadine's family, this meant that they would not have to endure another trial, but it also meant that questions about his motivations and mental state at the time of the murder may never be fully answered. The case continues to influence legal and social responses to domestic violence in Ireland. It is regularly cited in academic studies, policy documents, and training materials as an example of how domestic violence can escalate to homicide and how the criminal justice system can respond effectively to such cases. Nadine Lott was 30 years old when her life was brutally cut short by someone who claimed to have loved her. In those 30 years, she had built a successful career, raised a beloved daughter, and created deep, lasting relationships with family and friends. She had dreams for the future, plans for her daughter's upbringing, and goals for her continuing professional development. All of that was destroyed in a few hours of violence on a December night in 2019. Her story is ultimately about more than just domestic violence, though that was the cause of her death. It's about the preciousness of life, the importance of recognizing and responding to warning signs of abuse, and the devastating ripple effects that violence has on families and communities. Nadine's case demonstrates that domestic violence can affect anyone, regardless of their education, professional success, or social support networks. She was not isolated or powerless. She had a thriving business, close family relationships, and a community that knew and respected her. Yet she still became a victim of the man who couldn't accept that their relationship was over. The justice that her family eventually achieved through Murtagh's conviction and life sentence was important, but it couldn't undo the damage that had been done. They couldn't bring Nadine back to raise her daughter, couldn't restore the family relationships that had been shattered by her death, and couldn't fulfill the dreams and plans that died with her that December night. What her story can do is serve as a reminder of the importance of taking domestic violence seriously. of believing victims when they report threats or abuse, and of providing support and resources to help people escape dangerous relationships safely. It can remind us that behind every statistic about domestic violence is a real person, someone like Nadine who had a full life, people who loved her deeply, and dreams that will now never be fulfilled. The text messages that emerged during the investigation showed us that Nadine was aware of the danger she faced. When Murtagh wrote to her, "Just don't slip," she recognized it for what it was, a threat. She wasn't naive about what he was capable of, but like many victims of domestic violence, she found herself trapped in an impossible situation where every response carried risks. In the quiet coastal town of Arklow, where Nadine had built her life as a beautician and devoted mother, her absence is still felt deeply. The apartment on St. Mary's Road, where she died, has become a reminder of how quickly violence can shatter lives and communities. But more importantly, her life and death have become part of a larger conversation about how society can better protect vulnerable individuals and prevent such tragedies. Please, if this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to the channel where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, we journey to the quiet suburbs of Willoughby Hills, Ohio, where beneath the surface of what appeared to be a loving foster family, dark secrets would eventually lead to one of the most shocking betrayals in recent memory. This is the story of Lisa Nofel, a devoted social worker and mother whose life was cut short in the most unimaginable way by those she trusted most. Lisa Marie Nofel was 41 years old in the autumn of 2012. She lived in Willoughby Hills, Ohio, a peaceful suburb nestled in the rolling hills east of Cleveland. The community was known for its tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, and the kind of neighborly atmosphere where children could still ride their bikes safely after dark. Lisa embodied the very spirit of this community. By profession, she was a social worker with the Cuyahoga County Division of Job and Family Services, specifically working in the sex abuse department. It was demanding, emotionally taxing work that required not just professional competence but genuine compassion. Day after day, Lisa encountered children who had suffered unimaginable trauma. She listened to their stories, advocated for their safety, and worked tirelessly to place them in loving homes where they could heal and grow. Those who knew Lisa described her as someone who truly lived her values. She wasn't the type of social worker who simply processed cases and went home. She carried these children's stories with her, worried about them, and celebrated their small victories as if they were her own. Her friend Carol Beese would later say that Lisa made sure she went the extra mile to be a good parent. Lisa's dedication to helping children wasn't confined to her professional life. At home, she was a loving mother to her own children, and had opened her doors to foster children as well. She was married to Kevin Nofel, a truck driver whose work often took him away from home for days at a time. Despite the challenges of single parenting while Kevin was on the road, Lisa managed to create a warm, stable home environment. The Nofel household was busy but happy. Lisa's 13-year-old daughter Megan lived with them, along with a younger child. The family had also welcomed foster children over the years, believing deeply in providing safe harbor for those who needed it most. For Lisa, fostering wasn't just about providing food and shelter. It was about offering genuine love and support to young people who had often experienced the worst that life could offer. In July 2011, the Nofels received a placement that would change everything. 16-year-old Sabrina Zunick came to live with them through the foster care system. Sabrina Ann Zunick was born on October 27, 1994, into circumstances that no child should endure. Her biological parents struggled with addiction, both alcoholism and drug dependency, creating an unstable and often dangerous home environment. For a young child trying to make sense of the world, such chaos leaves deep scars. The details of Sabrina's early years paint a picture of neglect and instability. Children who grow up in homes affected by severe addiction often experience what psychologists call developmental trauma. Their fundamental sense of safety and trust in the world becomes fractured before they even have the cognitive tools to understand what's happening to them. By the time she was 16, Sabrina had already been through multiple placements in the foster care system. Each transition, each new home, each new set of rules and expectations added another layer of complexity to her emotional landscape. Some foster children thrive despite these challenges, finding resilience within themselves and responding positively to stable, loving environments. Others unfortunately carry forward patterns of behavior and ways of relating to the world that were formed during their earliest, most traumatic experiences. When Sabrina arrived at the Nofel home in July 2011, Lisa approached her new foster daughter with the same compassion and dedication she brought to all aspects of her work with children. She understood that troubled teenagers often needed extra patience, extra consistency, and extra love before they could begin to trust and heal. Initially, things seemed to go well. Sabrina appeared to be settling into the household routine. She had her own room, was enrolled in school, and was included in family activities. To outside observers, the Nofels seemed to be providing exactly the kind of stable, nurturing environment that could help a traumatized teenager begin to rebuild her life. But beneath the surface, something much more sinister was beginning to take shape. Kevin Nofel was 47 years old and had been married to Lisa for several years. As a long-haul truck driver, he spent significant portions of his time away from home, traveling across state lines to make deliveries. This meant that Lisa often shouldered the bulk of the day-to-day parenting responsibilities, including the complex task of helping Sabrina adjust to their family. When Kevin was home, however, he began to pay particular attention to their teenage foster daughter. What started as what might have seemed like a father figure showing interest in a troubled teen's life gradually evolved into something far more inappropriate and ultimately illegal. The exact timeline of when Kevin's interest in Sabrina crossed from paternal to predatory isn't entirely clear from the court records. What we do know is that Kevin, a middle-aged man in a position of authority and trust, began to cultivate a sexual relationship with Sabrina, who was not only a minor but also a vulnerable teenager under his care. This wasn't a case of teenage rebellion or a forbidden romance between peers. This was statutory rape, a crime that recognizes that children and teenagers cannot legally consent to sexual relationships with adults, particularly adults in positions of authority over them. The law exists to protect minors from exactly this kind of exploitation. For Sabrina, who had already experienced trauma and instability throughout her childhood, this relationship with Kevin likely felt complicated. Adults who prey on vulnerable teenagers are often skilled manipulators. They may make the teenager feel special, chosen, mature beyond their years. They may promise love, security, or a future together. For a young person who has experienced rejection and abandonment, these promises can feel like lifelines. Kevin was careful to keep his relationship with Sabrina hidden from Lisa. The secrecy wasn't just about avoiding consequences. It was also part of the manipulation. Shared secrets create a sense of intimacy and complicity. By making Sabrina a co-conspirator and hiding their relationship, Kevin was pulling her deeper into a web of deception that would become increasingly difficult to escape. As their relationship continued, Kevin began to plant seeds of an even more disturbing nature. He started to speak negatively about Lisa to Sabrina. He portrayed his wife as an obstacle to their happiness, someone standing in the way of their future together. This type of psychological manipulation is designed to shift the victim's loyalty away from other relationships and toward the abuser. What Sabrina couldn't fully understand at 17 years old was that she was being groomed, not just for a sexual relationship, but potentially for something far more sinister. By late 2012, Kevin's manipulation of Sabrina had reached a dangerous new level. He began to speak openly about wanting Lisa dead. These weren't casual complaints about marital problems or expressions of frustration. Kevin was methodically planning the idea that Lisa's death would solve all their problems. He painted a picture of their future together, after Lisa was gone. They could be together openly, he told Sabrina. They could take the children and start fresh somewhere else. And there was another element to his persuasion: money. Kevin knew that Lisa had life insurance policies, totaling approximately $85,000. In his twisted logic, Lisa's death would not only remove the obstacle to his relationship with Sabrina, but also provide them financial security. For a 17-year-old who had grown up in poverty and instability, the promise of love and financial security must have seemed like a fairy tale ending. But Kevin wasn't just painting pretty pictures of their future. He was also using darker forms of manipulation. According to testimony that would later come out in court, Kevin told Sabrina that he would commit suicide if Lisa wasn't killed. This type of emotional manipulation, threatening self-harm to control someone else's behavior, is a particularly cruel form of psychological abuse. For a teenager who had already experienced significant loss and trauma, the threat that the person she believed loved her would kill himself unless she acted was devastatingly effective. Kevin began to give Sabrina specific instructions. He told her exactly how to kill Lisa, when to do it, and how to make it look like something other than a planned murder. The level of detail in his planning reveals a calculating mind that had thought through multiple aspects of committing the perfect crime. He planned to be away on a trucking run when the murder took place, giving himself an airtight alibi. The timing wasn't coincidental. Kevin deliberately scheduled his departure to coincide with when he wanted Lisa killed. He instructed Sabrina to wait until Lisa was asleep, to use a knife from their own kitchen, and to make sure the attack was thorough enough that Lisa couldn't survive to identify her attacker. The plan revealed Kevin's fundamental callousness, not just toward his wife, but also toward Sabrina herself. He was willing to destroy this teenager's life to get what he wanted. He was asking her to commit murder, knowing that she would face the legal consequences while he maintained his alibi. Even if their plan had worked perfectly, Sabrina would have carried the psychological weight of having killed the woman who had welcomed her into their home and tried to provide her with stability and love. As November 2012 approached, Kevin's plan was nearly ready to be set in motion. November 16th, 2012 was a Friday night in Willoughby Hills. The autumn air was crisp and most families in the neighborhood were settling in for a quiet weekend. Lisa Nofel had finished her work week at the county social services office and was home with her children. Kevin was, as planned, away on a trucking run. His absence from the house that night was carefully orchestrated. He had made sure to be far enough away that he couldn't possibly be considered a suspect in what was about to happen. 13-year-old Megan was in the house that night, along with the family's younger child and 18-year-old Sabrina. To all appearances, it was a normal evening in the Nofel household. Lisa had no reason to suspect that danger was lurking within her own home, from someone she had tried to help and protect. Sabrina waited until she believed everyone was asleep. The house was quiet, dark, except for the soft glow of nightlights in the hallways. Lisa was in her bedroom, resting after another week of demanding work, helping abused children find safety and healing. At some point after 1:00 a.m., Sabrina made her way to the kitchen and selected a 10-inch serrated knife. The choice of weapon wasn't random. This was one of the specific instructions Kevin had given her. A knife would make the attack appear more spontaneous, less planned than the gun might suggest. Sabrina then crept through the darkened house to Lisa's bedroom. What happened next was captured not through eyewitness testimony from the victim. Lisa couldn't survive to tell her own story, but through the horrific physical evidence left behind and the traumatic witness account of 13-year-old Megan. Sabrina attacked Lisa as she slept. The assault was brutal beyond comprehension. According to the medical examiner's report, Lisa Nofel was stabbed 798 times. Some sources indicate she suffered nearly 200 wounds when cuts are included with the stab wounds. This wasn't a quick killing, or even an attack driven by sudden rage. This was sustained, methodical violence that went far beyond what was necessary to cause death. The term forensic experts use for this type of extreme violence is overkill. Violence that exceeds what would be necessary to kill the victim. Overkill often indicates either extreme emotional involvement in the crime, or conversely an attempt to ensure the victim is definitely dead. In Sabrina's case, it may have been both. The teenager had been programmed by Kevin to make sure Lisa was dead, but the excessive nature of the attack suggests that other psychological factors were also in play. The attack woke 13-year-old Megan, who found herself witnessing one of the most traumatic scenes imaginable. Her foster sister was attacking her mother with unimaginable violence. The child's screams and cries filled the house as she called 911. The 911 call was made at 1:15 a.m. Megan, despite her terror and shock, was able to give the dispatcher their address and explain that Sabrina was attacking her mother with a knife. The call captured not only Megan's terror, but also the sounds of the attack still in progress. Police officers Randy Mullinax and his colleagues responded to the scene within minutes, but it was already too late for Lisa. Officer Mullinax would later tell Datline, "I could barely even see flesh color. There was so much blood on her." When police arrived at the Chagrin Drive home, They found Sabrina still at the scene, covered in blood. There was no attempt to flee, no attempt to stage the scene to look like a break-in or random attack. Lisa's body was found in her bedroom, and the physical evidence made it immediately clear what had happened. Sabrina was arrested at the scene. The 18-year-old offered little resistance and initially provided no explanation for what had driven her to kill the woman who had opened her home and heart to her. In the immediate aftermath of Lisa Nofel's murder, the case appeared straightforward to investigators. They had the perpetrator, Sabrina Zunick, had been caught at the scene, covered in the victim's blood, with the murder weapon nearby. Megan had witnessed the attack and could testify to what she had seen. From an evidentiary standpoint, this looked like one of the easier murder cases the Lake County Sheriff's Office had ever worked. But experienced investigators know that the most important question in any murder case isn't just who, but why. And Sabrina's motive for killing Lisa Nofel wasn't immediately apparent. Sabrina initially remained largely silent about her reasons for the attack. She was cooperative with police in the sense that she didn't deny what she had done. The evidence was too overwhelming for denial to be possible. But she offered no explanation that made sense to investigators or prosecutors. Lisa Nofel had been, by all accounts, a loving and supportive foster mother. She hadn't been abusive towards Sabrina. There had been no recent conflicts or disciplinary issues that might have triggered such extreme violence. Co-workers, friends, and other family members described Lisa as someone who genuinely cared about helping troubled children. Moreover, the extreme nature of the violence troubled investigators. While some teenagers in foster care do struggle with behavioral problems, including violence, the level of brutality in Lisa's murder suggested something more complex was at play. The 7 teenage stab wounds indicated either a complete psychological break or a level of rage that seemed disproportionate to any known conflicts between Lisa and Sabrina. Investigators began to look more closely at the family dynamics. They interviewed Kevin Nofel, who was, of course, devastated by his wife's death and shocked by Sabrina's actions. Kevin presented himself as a grieving husband who couldn't understand how the teenager they had tried to help could have done something so horrible. But as investigators dug deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge. Kevin's cell phone records, financial information, and travel schedules were scrutinized. Detectives also began to interview Sabrina more extensively, and slowly, pieces of a much more complex story began to emerge. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators learned about the sexual relationship between Kevin and Sabrina. Once this information came to light, everything about the murder took on a different dimension. Suddenly, there was a potential motive that made sense. Not just for Sabrina's actions, but potentially for Kevin's involvement as well. The $85,000 in life insurance policies on Lisa's life also caught investigators' attention. While many married couples have life insurance, the amount was substantial. And the timing of the murder, with Kevin conveniently away from home, seemed increasingly suspicious. As the investigation continued, a picture began to emerge of a calculated murder plot, with Kevin as the mastermind and Sabrina as his manipulated accomplice. But proving this theory would require getting Sabrina to tell the truth about what had really happened in the months leading up to November 16th. For nearly 10 months, the full truth remained hidden. Sabrina maintained her silence about Kevin's involvement, perhaps still believing in the promises he had made, or fearing the consequences of revealing their relationship. During this time, Kevin continued to play the role of the grieving widower, even as investigators built their case against him. The breakthrough in the case came in September 2013, nearly 10 months after Lisa's murder. During this time, investigators had been methodically building their case against both Sabrina and Kevin. They had evidence of the sexual relationship, evidence of Kevin's financial motives, and evidence of his suspicious behavior around the time of the murder. More importantly, they had been working to gain Sabrina's trust and cooperation. Experienced investigators understand that teenagers who have been manipulated by adults often need time and patience before they can fully understand and articulate what happened to them. Sabrina had been not just a perpetrator but also a victim of Kevin's manipulation, of statutory rape, and of psychological abuse. Finally, Sabrina began to tell the truth about Kevin's role in planning Lisa's murder. The story that emerged was even more disturbing than investigators had initially suspected. Sabrina revealed that Kevin had been methodically planning Lisa's death for months. He had given her detailed instructions about how to kill his wife, when to do it, and how to make sure she was dead. He had promised Sabrina that after Lisa was gone, they could be together openly and would have access to the life insurance money. Perhaps most chilling of all, Sabrina testified that Kevin had threatened to commit suicide if she didn't go through with killing Lisa. For a teenager who believed herself to be in love with this older man, this ultimatum was devastatingly effective psychological manipulation. The revelation of Kevin's role in planning the murder transformed the case. What had initially appeared to be a senseless act of violence by a troubled teenager was revealed to be a calculated murder-for-hire scheme, with Kevin using his position of authority and trust to manipulate Sabrina into becoming his weapon. In July 2014, a Lake County grand jury indicted Sabrina on charges of aggravated murder. By this time, she had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors and testify against Kevin in exchange for a plea agreement. On August 28, 2014, Sabrina Zunic, now 19 years old, appeared in a Lake County courthouse to plead guilty to aggravated murder in the death of Lisa Nofel. The courtroom was packed with family members, friends of Lisa, and members of the media who had followed the case. Standing before the judge, Sabrina formally admitted her role in Lisa's death. The plea agreement she had reached with prosecutors would spare her the death penalty in exchange for her cooperation in the case against Kevin and her agreement to serve a sentence of 30 years to life in prison. During her testimony at Kevin's trial, the full scope of his manipulation became clear. Sabrina described how Kevin had groomed her for a sexual relationship, isolated her from other relationships, and gradually convinced her that killing Lisa was the only way they could be together. She testified about the specific instructions Kevin had given her about how to kill Lisa, including his directive to make sure she's dead by inflicting multiple wounds. She also revealed Kevin's threats of suicide if she didn't go through with the plan. The testimony was devastating, not just for its content but for what it revealed about Kevin's complete lack of regard for both his wife's life and Sabrina's future. He had been willing to destroy multiple lives to get what he wanted: Lisa's life insurance money and freedom to be with his teenage victim. Kevin Nofel's trial began in earnest after Sabrina's plea agreement was finalized. The prosecution's case against him was comprehensive, including evidence of the sexual relationship with Sabrina, which constituted multiple counts of statutory rape, evidence of his financial motives, and Sabrina's testimony about his role in planning the murder. The defense attempted to portray Sabrina as an unstable teenager who had acted on her own and was now trying to shift blame to Kevin. They argued that there was no physical evidence directly linking Kevin to the planning of the murder, and that Sabrina's testimony couldn't be trusted. However, the prosecution was able to demonstrate a pattern of manipulation and control that was consistent with Sabrina's account. Kevin's cell phone records, his work schedule, and his financial situation all supported the theory that he had planned his wife's murder. On September 24, 2014, after deliberating for several hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all 11 charges against Kevin Nofel. He was convicted of 2 counts of conspiracy to commit aggravated murder, 3 counts of complicity to aggravated murder, and 6 counts of sexual battery based on his relationship with Sabrina. Kevin was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder charges, plus additional time for the sexual battery convictions. At sentencing, the judge noted the particularly egregious nature of Kevin's crimes. Not only had he orchestrated his wife's murder, but he had done so by manipulating and abusing a vulnerable teenager under his care. The conviction of Kevin Nofel and the sentencing of Sabrina Zunic brought a measure of legal closure to Lisa Nofel's murder. But the ripple effects of the crime continued to impact many lives. 13-year-old Megan, who had witnessed her mother's murder, would require years of therapy and support to process the trauma. Not only had she lost her mother in the most violent way imaginable, but she had learned that the crime was orchestrated by her stepfather and committed by her foster sister, 2 people she had trusted and lived with. The foster care system also grappled with the implications of the case. How had Kevin's inappropriate relationship with Sabrina gone undetected? What safeguards needed to be put in place to better protect vulnerable teenagers in foster homes? The case highlighted the particular risks faced by teenagers in care who may be more susceptible to manipulation by adults in positions of authority. Lisa's colleagues at the Cuyahoga County Division of Job and Family Services mourned the loss of a dedicated social worker who had genuinely cared about protecting children. The irony that Lisa, who had spent her career working to protect abused children, had been killed in a plot that involved the abuse of a child under her own roof, was not lost on those who knew her. In 2016, 2 years after Kevin's conviction, Lisa's family filed a civil lawsuit seeking damages related to her death. In 2017, they were awarded $6.2 million in damages, though the practical value of such a judgment against incarcerated defendants was limited. The civil case did provide another forum for the full scope of Kevin's crimes to be acknowledged and for Lisa's family to have their loss recognized in monetary terms. The murder of Lisa Nofel represents a complex intersection of several criminal behaviors: domestic violence, child abuse, manipulation, and murder for financial gain. Understanding how these elements came together helps explain how such a horrific crime could occur within what appeared to be a loving family. Kevin Nofel's crimes began with his sexual abuse of Sabrina. This wasn't a case of a romance that crossed age boundaries. It was statutory rape, a crime that recognizes that children cannot consent to sexual relationships with adults, particularly adults in positions of authority over them. Research on child sexual abuse shows that perpetrators often use a process called grooming to prepare their victims for abuse. This process typically involves gradually breaking down the child's boundaries, creating a sense of special relationship, and isolating the child from other sources of support and information. Kevin's grooming of Sabrina appears to have followed this pattern. He made her feel special and chosen, created secrets between them that isolated her from Lisa and other family members, and gradually escalated their relationship from inappropriate attention to sexual abuse. The next phase of Kevin's manipulation involved turning Sabrina against Lisa. This type of psychological manipulation is sometimes called splitting, convincing the victim that there are only two sides, that the victim must choose between the abuser and other relationships in their life. By portraying Lisa as an obstacle to their happiness and future together, Kevin was preparing Sabrina to see his wife as an enemy, rather than as the caring foster mother she actually was. This psychological preparation was crucial to his plan to convince Sabrina to commit murder. The financial motive: Lisa's $85,000 in life insurance provided Kevin with a practical reason for wanting his wife dead, but the psychological manipulation of Sabrina gave him the means to accomplish his goal, while maintaining his own alibi. The extreme violence of the attack, 78 stab wounds, likely reflected several factors. Kevin had specifically instructed Sabrina to make sure Lisa was dead, which may have contributed to the overkill. Additionally, the act of stabbing someone requires the attacker to be in close physical contact with the victim, making it a particularly brutal and traumatic form of violence. For Sabrina, the psychological impact of committing such an extreme act of violence against someone who had tried to care for her would have been devastating. The excessive nature of the attack may have reflected her internal conflict about what she was doing, even as she felt compelled to follow Kevin's instructions. The prosecution of this case required navigating complex legal and ethical issues. How should the justice system handle a case where one defendant was clearly the mastermind, while the other was both a perpetrator and a victim? Sabrina Zunick was 18 years old when she killed Lisa Nofel, making her legally an adult and fully responsible for her actions under the law. However, the relationship between Kevin and Sabrina had begun when she was 16, making her a statutory rape victim. This created a situation where Sabrina was simultaneously a murderer and a victim of sexual abuse. The prosecution's decision to offer Sabrina a plea agreement in exchange for her testimony against Kevin reflected this complex reality. While Sabrina had committed murder and needed to face serious consequences, her cooperation was essential to ensuring that Kevin faced justice for his role as the mastermind of the plot. The sentence of 30 years to life that Sabrina received meant that she would serve at least 30 years in prison before becoming eligible for parole. Given that she was 19 at sentencing, this meant she wouldn't even be considered for release until she was nearly 50 years old. Some observers questioned whether this sentence was too harsh for someone who had been manipulated and abused. Others argued that regardless of the manipulation she had experienced, Sabrina had still chosen to commit an extremely violent murder and should face the full consequences of that choice. The prosecution of Kevin Nofel was more straightforward from a legal perspective, but the challenge was proving his involvement in a crime he had been careful to distance himself from physically. The case relied heavily on Sabrina's testimony, which defense attorneys naturally attacked as unreliable. However, the prosecution was able to corroborate key elements of Sabrina's account through other evidence. Kevin's work schedule, cell phone records, and financial situation all supported the theory that he had planned Lisa's murder. The evidence of his sexual relationship with Sabrina was also crucial in establishing his motive and his pattern of manipulative behavior. The guilty verdicts on all 11 counts against Kevin reflected the jury's conclusion that the evidence supported the prosecution's theory of the case. The life sentence without possibility of parole ensured that Kevin would never be released from prison. The murder of Lisa Nofel offers several important lessons for society, particularly regarding the protection of children in foster care and the recognition of manipulation in abusive relationships. First, the case highlights the particular vulnerability of teenagers in foster care. These young people have often experienced significant trauma and may be more susceptible to manipulation by adults who offer them attention, affection, or promises of security. The case underscored the need for better screening and monitoring of foster homes, particularly regarding inappropriate relationships between foster parents and foster children. Second, the case illustrates how financial motives can drive people to commit horrific crimes, even against those closest to them. Kevin's willingness to kill his wife for life insurance money while using a manipulated teenager as his weapon demonstrates a level of callousness that is difficult to comprehend. Third, the case shows how psychological manipulation can lead vulnerable individuals to commit acts they would never have considered on their own. Sabrina's transformation from a troubled but non-violent teenager to someone capable of committing such an extreme act of violence illustrates the power of sustained psychological abuse and manipulation. The case also highlighted the importance of recognizing signs of inappropriate relationships between adults and minors. In hindsight, there may have been warning signs of Kevin's relationship with Sabrina that went unrecognized or unreported. For the foster care system, Lisa's murder led to discussions about how to better protect children in care from abuse by foster parents. While most foster families provide loving, safe homes for children who need them, the potential for abuse always exists, and systems need to be in place to prevent and detect such abuse. Lisa Nofel's legacy lies not just in the tragic circumstances of her death, but in her life's work protecting vulnerable children. Colleagues remembered her as someone who truly cared about the children she worked with, and who went above and beyond to ensure their safety and well-being. The irony that someone who dedicated her life to protecting children was ultimately killed in a plot that involved the abuse and manipulation of a child under her own roof adds another layer of tragedy to her story. Lisa had opened her home to Sabrina with the intention of providing safety and stability, never knowing that her husband was using that same teenager as a weapon against her. As of 2024, both Sabrina Zunic and Kevin Nofel remain incarcerated in Ohio state prisons. Sabrina, now in her late 20s, has participated in prison interviews where she has expressed remorse for her actions and discussed her understanding of how she was manipulated by Kevin. In interviews, Sabrina has described the psychological hold that Kevin had over her and how his threats of suicide made her feel that she had no choice but to follow his instructions. She has also spoken about her regret for the pain she caused to Lisa's family, and for her role in taking the life of someone who had tried to help her. Kevin Nofel, now in his late 50s, continues to serve his life sentence without possibility of parole. Unlike Sabrina, he has not publicly expressed remorse or accepted responsibility for his role in planning his wife's murder. Megan, Lisa's daughter, who witnessed the attack, has grown up and moved forward with her life, though the trauma of that night will likely stay with her forever. The younger child who was in the home that night has also had to process the loss of their mother and the betrayal by family members they trusted. The case continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and legal experts as an example of how multiple forms of abuse can intersect to create the conditions for extreme violence. It serves as a reminder of the importance of protecting vulnerable individuals, particularly children, from those who would exploit and manipulate them. Lisa Nofel's memory lives on through the children she helped during her career as a social worker, and through the lessons that her tragic death taught about the need to better protect children in care. Her dedication to helping others, even at the cost of her own safety, exemplifies the best of human nature, even as her death illustrates some of the worst. As we close this story tonight, we're reminded that true crime isn't just about the sensational details of criminal cases, but about understanding the human factors that lead to tragedy. The murder of Lisa Nofel was ultimately a story about trust betrayed, love manipulated, and the terrible consequences when those who should protect the vulnerable instead exploit them for their own purposes. In examining these darker chapters of human behavior, we perhaps gain better understanding of the importance of vigilance, compassion, and the protection of those who cannot protect themselves. Lisa Nofel dedicated her life to these principles. And in remembering her story, we honor not just her memory, but the values she lived by. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now let's move on to our third story. Story 3. In the quiet suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, where palm trees cast long shadows in the desert moonlight, January 16, 1997, began like any other Thursday evening. The Falater family had settled into their comfortable routine in their modest home on East Minnesota Avenue. Scott Falater, a 42-year-old electrical engineer at Motorola, was known throughout the neighborhood as a gentle, soft-spoken man who took pride in his manicured lawn and his devotion to his Mormon faith. His wife, Jarmila, was 41 years old and had emigrated to the United States from Czechoslovakia decades earlier. She worked as a teacher and was beloved by her students for her patience and kindness. The couple had been married for 20 years and had 2 teenagers, Michael, who was 17, and Caitlin, who was 15. To their neighbors, they appeared to be the perfect American family, the kind you might see featured in a feel-good television commercial. That evening, as the Arizona desert began to cool from the day's heat, Scott had been working on a project in his garage. It was something he often did, tinkering with electronics, fixing household items, staying busy with his hands. Jarmila had spent the evening grading papers at the kitchen table, occasionally glancing out the window at the backyard pool that shimmered under the porch lights. The children were in their rooms, likely doing homework or talking on the phone with friends, as teenagers do. The house was filled with the comfortable sounds of a family going about their evening routines. There was no indication that within hours this peaceful domestic scene would be shattered forever. Around 10 p.m., Scott went to bed. He had work the next morning, and he was a man of routine who valued his sleep. Jarmila stayed up a little longer, finishing her grading and perhaps watching a bit of television before joining her husband. The house grew quiet, save for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak that old houses make as they settle for the night. What happened next would become one of the most controversial criminal cases in Arizona history. A case that would challenge our understanding of consciousness, responsibility, and the mysterious world of sleep. At approximately 11:30 p.m., Greg Coons, the Falaters' next-door neighbor, was awakened by what he would later describe as blood-curdling screams. These weren't the kind of screams you might dismiss as children playing or a television turned up too loud. These were desperate, terrifying sounds that made his blood run cold. Coons quietly moved to his bedroom window and peered out into the darkness of his backyard, which offered a view of the Falaters' pool area. What he witnessed would haunt him for the rest of his life, and would serve as the key testimony that would eventually send Scott Falater to prison for life. Through the dim light cast by the Falaters' porch lamp, Coons could see a man dragging what appeared to be a body toward the family pool. The figure was methodical, almost mechanical in his movements. There was no panic, no urgency, just a systematic purposefulness that seemed oddly detached from the horror of the situation. The man who Coons would later identify as Scott Falater placed the body at the edge of the pool and then did something that defied all logic and humanity. He held the person's head underwater. For several minutes, Scott Falater stood there in his pajamas, calmly drowning his wife of 20 years while their children slept inside the house. Coons watched in stunned disbelief, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This was Scott Falater, the quiet neighbor who always waved hello, who kept his lawn immaculate, who helped elderly neighbors with their groceries. This was the man who went to church every Sunday with his family, who had never shown any signs of violence or aggression. But there he was, in the middle of the night, methodically ending his wife's life. Coons immediately called 911. His voice shaky with adrenaline and disbelief, he reported what he had witnessed. The emergency operator tried to keep him calm while dispatching police to the scene. Those minutes felt like hours as Coons continued to watch from his window, hoping against hope that somehow he had misunderstood what he was seeing. When the police arrived at the Falater home just minutes later, they found a scene that would be seared into their memories forever. Jarmila Falater's body was floating face down in the family pool, her nightgown billowing around her like a dark flower. The water was tinged with blood, and there were obvious signs of trauma to her body. Scott Falater was still in the backyard when officers arrived. He was wearing his pajama pants and appeared to be cleaning up. There was blood on his hands and clothes, and he had what appeared to be a fresh bandage on one of his fingers. When the officers approached him, his reaction was not what they expected from someone who had just committed such a brutal crime. Scott seemed confused, disoriented, almost as if he had just awakened from a deep sleep. When officers asked him what had happened, he appeared genuinely bewildered. He looked at his wife's body in the pool with what witnesses described as shock and confusion, as if he was seeing the scene for the first time. "I don't know what happened," he told the officers. "I don't remember anything." The police weren't buying it. In their experience, people who claimed not to remember committing violent crimes were usually trying to avoid responsibility. They had a witness who had seen Scott Falater drown his wife. They had physical evidence, and they had the suspect right there at the scene. It seemed like an open and shut case. But as they began to process the crime scene, some details emerged that didn't quite fit the typical pattern of domestic homicide. First, there was the matter of the wounds. When the medical examiner arrived and began his preliminary examination of Jarmila's body, he discovered that she had been stabbed 44 times with what appeared to be a hunting knife. The wounds were scattered across her body, her back, her chest, her arms, and her hands. Many of them were defensive wounds, suggesting that Jarmila had fought for her life. But here's where things got strange. Most of the wounds were relatively shallow, while some were certainly fatal. Many appeared to be tentative, almost hesitant. This was unusual for a crime of passion, where wounds are typically deep and delivered with extreme force. It was as if the attacker had been uncertain, lacking the full commitment that usually accompanies such violent acts. Second, there was Scott's behavior during and after the attack. According to the neighbor's testimony, Scott had moved with a strange, mechanical precision. There was no shouting, no apparent emotion, no signs of the rage that typically accompany domestic violence. He had simply gone about the business of killing his wife with an eerie calmness. After drowning Jarmila in the pool, Scott had apparently gone back into the house. Police found evidence that he had changed his clothes, putting his bloodied pajama top in the washing machine. He had also taken the time to bandage a small cut on his finger, a cut that investigators believed he had sustained during the stabbing. Most puzzling of all, Scott had then gone to the backyard shed to hide the hunting knife used in the attack. This suggested a level of consciousness and planning that seemed to contradict his claims of not remembering anything. As detectives interviewed the Falater children, they learned more about their parents' relationship. Both Michael and Caitlin described their parents as loving and devoted to each other. They couldn't recall ever hearing their parents fight or argue in any serious way. There had been no signs of domestic violence, no history of abuse, no indication that their father harbored any resentment or anger toward their mother. Scott Falater had no criminal history. He had never been arrested, never been involved in any violent incidents. His co-workers at Motorola described him as reliable, hard-working, and mild-mannered. His neighbors knew him as helpful and friendly. His fellow church members respected him as a devoted family man and faithful congregation member. None of it made sense. Here was a man with no history of violence, no apparent motive, and no memory of committing a brutal crime that seemed completely out of character. Yet the evidence was overwhelming. Scott Falater had stabbed his wife 44 times, and then drowned her in their family pool while their children slept. The investigation continued for months, as prosecutors built their case for first-degree murder. They theorized that Scott had planned the attack, that his claim of not remembering was simply a convenient lie designed to avoid responsibility. They pointed to his actions after the murder, changing clothes, hiding the weapon, bandaging his wound, as evidence that he had been fully conscious and aware of his actions. But Scott's defense team had a different theory, one that would captivate the nation and spark debates about the nature of consciousness itself. They believed that Scott Falater had indeed killed his wife, but that he had done so while sleepwalking. The idea seemed almost ridiculous. Could someone really commit such a complex, violent act while unconscious? Could a person stab someone 44 times, drag the body to a pool, drown the victim, and then engage in elaborate cover-up behavior, all while asleep? Scott's attorneys began researching the phenomenon of sleepwalking, technically known as somnambulism. They discovered that sleepwalking is more common and more complex than most people realize. During deep sleep, some individuals can perform remarkably complicated tasks while remaining completely unconscious. Sleepwalkers have been known to cook meals, drive cars, and even perform their jobs, all while asleep. More disturbing, there were documented cases of sleepwalkers committing violent acts. In 1987, a Canadian man named Kenneth Parks drove 14 miles to his in-laws' house while sleepwalking and brutally attacked them, killing his mother-in-law and severely injuring his father-in-law. A jury acquitted him of murder, accepting that he had been sleepwalking during the attack. The defense team learned that Scott did indeed have a history of sleepwalking. His family members testified that he had been a sleepwalker since childhood. As an adult, he would sometimes get up in the middle of the night and perform various tasks around the house, fixing things, organizing his workshop, even doing yard work. His wife and children were accustomed to finding evidence of his nocturnal activities in the morning. Just a few weeks before Yarmila's murder, Scott had been working on fixing a swimming pool light. The light was malfunctioning, and Scott had been frustrated by his inability to repair it. His family members would later testify that he had been preoccupied with this project, even mentioning it in his sleep. The defense theory was that on the night of January 16th, Scott had been sleepwalking when he went outside to work on the pool light. Somehow, in his unconscious state, he had encountered Yarmila and attacked her. The multiple stab wounds, they argued, were consistent with the repetitive, automatic behaviors often exhibited by sleepwalkers. To support this theory, the defense hired sleep experts to examine Scott and testify about sleepwalking behavior. Dr. Rosalind Cartwright, a renowned sleep researcher, conducted extensive tests on Scott and concluded that he was indeed capable of complex behaviors while sleepwalking. She testified that sleepwalkers could engage in violent acts without any conscious awareness or intent. Dr. Stuart Dosing, another sleep expert, explained to the jury how sleepwalking occurs during the deepest stages of sleep, when the conscious mind is completely offline but the parts of the brain that control motor function remain active. In this state, he argued, a person could perform complex actions while having no conscious awareness or memory of their behavior. The defense also pointed out that Scott's behavior immediately after the murder was consistent with someone awakening from a sleepwalking episode. His confusion and apparent shock when police arrived could be explained by the disorientation that typically follows sleepwalking incidents. But the prosecution wasn't convinced. They brought in their own experts who argued that the complexity of Scott's actions, stabbing Yarmila 44 times, dragging her to the pool, holding her underwater, changing clothes, hiding the weapon, and bandaging his wound, was far too sophisticated for someone who was truly unconscious. Dr. Philip Keene, the medical examiner, testified about the nature of Yarmila's wounds. He described how she had fought for her life, evidenced by the defensive wounds on her hands and arms. The prosecution argued that someone who was truly sleepwalking wouldn't have been able to overcome such resistance, or to continue the attack for the extended period necessary to inflict 44 stab wounds. Perhaps most damaging to Scott's defense was the testimony of Greg Coons, the neighbor who had witnessed the drowning. Coons testified that Scott's movements appeared deliberate and purposeful. He had watched as Scott methodically held Yarmila's head underwater for several minutes, an act that required sustained intent and awareness. The prosecution also highlighted Scott's actions after the murder. They argued that changing clothes, starting the washing machine, hiding the murder weapon, and bandaging his wound were conscious decisions that demonstrated awareness and intent to conceal evidence. These weren't the automatic, repetitive behaviors typically associated with sleepwalking. During the trial, Scott himself took the stand. He testified about his history of sleepwalking and his complete lack of memory regarding the night his wife died. He appeared genuinely remorseful and confused, breaking down in tears as he described waking up to find police in his backyard and learning that Yarmila was dead. "I loved my wife," he testified. "She was everything to me. I would never hurt her. I just don't understand what happened." Scott's children also testified on his behalf, describing their father as loving and gentle, never violent or aggressive. They corroborated his history of sleepwalking and expressed their belief that he would never consciously harm their mother. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture. They suggested that Scott's marriage wasn't as perfect as it appeared, pointing to financial pressures and the stress of raising teenagers. They theorized that Scott had planned the murder to appear like a random attack, using his history of sleepwalking as a convenient excuse. They also questioned why Scott had never sought treatment for his sleepwalking if it was serious enough to cause violent behavior. If he was capable of harming someone while asleep, they argued, wouldn't a responsible person take steps to prevent such incidents? The trial lasted several weeks and attracted national attention. The case raised profound questions about consciousness, free will, and criminal responsibility. If someone could commit murder while sleepwalking, could they be held legally responsible for their actions? Where do we draw the line between conscious choice and unconscious behavior? Legal experts debated the implications of the case. Some argued that accepting sleepwalking as a defense for violent crime could set a dangerous precedent, potentially allowing criminals to escape responsibility by claiming they were unconscious during their crimes. Others maintained that if Scott truly was sleepwalking, convicting him would be tantamount to punishing someone for something beyond their control. The jury deliberated for several days. They had to consider not just the evidence, but also the fundamental question of what it means to be conscious and responsible for one's actions. They reviewed the neighbor's testimony, the physical evidence, the expert opinions on both sides, and Scott's own claims of amnesia. In the end, they didn't believe him. On June 25, 1999, Scott Falater was convicted of first-degree murder. The jury concluded that regardless of his history of sleepwalking, the complexity and duration of his actions on the night of January 16, 1997, demonstrated conscious intent. They believed he was awake and aware when he killed his wife. Scott was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The conviction was controversial. Sleep researchers and some legal experts argued that the jury had failed to fully understand the complexity of sleepwalking behavior. They maintained that the prosecution had successfully created reasonable doubt about Scott's unconscious state. But that doubt shouldn't have been enough to overcome the evidence supporting the sleepwalking defense. Others, however, believed that justice had been served. They argued that even if Scott had been sleepwalking initially, he must have become conscious at some point during the prolonged attack. The systematic nature of his actions, especially the cover-up behavior afterwards, suggested awareness and intent. The case established important legal precedent regarding sleepwalking defenses. While courts have occasionally accepted sleepwalking as a mitigating factor in criminal cases, the Falater verdict made it clear that claims of unconsciousness would be subject to intense scrutiny. Prosecutors in future cases would point to the Falater conviction as evidence that complex violent acts couldn't be explained away by claims of sleepwalking. Scott Falater remains in prison today, more than 2 decades after his conviction. He has consistently maintained his innocence. Not in the sense that he didn't kill his wife, but in the sense that he wasn't conscious or responsible for his actions. In interviews over the years, he has expressed profound remorse and confusion about that night, saying that he wishes he could remember what happened so he could understand why. His children, Michael and Caitlin, were left to grapple with an unimaginable tragedy. In a single night, they lost their mother to violence and their father to the criminal justice system. They've had to live with the knowledge that their father killed their mother, while also believing in his claims that he wasn't conscious during the attack. In recent interviews, Scott's son Michael has spoken about the complexity of loving a father who killed his mother. He continues to believe that his father was sleepwalking, and that the conviction was unjust, while also struggling with anger and confusion about the loss of his mother. The case continues to fascinate researchers, legal experts, and true crime enthusiasts. It represents a unique intersection of neuroscience, criminal law, and human psychology. The questions it raises about consciousness and responsibility remain as relevant today as they were during the trial. Recent advances in sleep research have provided new insights into sleepwalking behavior. Scientists now know that sleepwalking occurs during non-REM sleep and involves partial arousal of the brain. Some regions become active while others remain in deep sleep, potentially allowing for complex behaviors without conscious awareness. Studies have documented increasingly sophisticated behaviors during sleepwalking episodes, including cases where individuals have driven cars, sent emails, and even performed surgery while unconscious. These findings have led some experts to reconsider whether the Falater case might have been decided differently with today's understanding of sleep disorders. However, the fundamental legal question remains. Even if complex behaviors are possible during sleepwalking, should they excuse criminal responsibility? Most legal systems require both intent and awareness for serious crimes like murder. If someone genuinely lacks both, can they be held accountable for their actions? The prosecution in Scott's case successfully argued that certain behaviors, particularly the systematic cover-up afterward, demonstrated consciousness and intent. But defense experts countered that sleepwalkers often engage in seemingly purposeful activities that actually lack conscious direction. The case also highlights the challenge of proving a negative. How can someone prove they weren't conscious? How can a jury determine with certainty what was happening inside someone's mind during a violent act? These epistemological questions make sleepwalking defenses particularly difficult to evaluate. Years later, Yarmila's death remains a tragedy that forever changed multiple families. She was a beloved teacher, mother, and wife who died in a horrific and senseless manner. Regardless of the questions surrounding Scott's mental state, her death represents a profound loss that rippled through her community. Her students remembered her as patient and kind, someone who took extra time to help struggling learners. Her colleagues described her as dedicated and professional, always willing to stay late to help a student or collaborate with a fellow teacher. Her death left a void in the lives of everyone who knew her. The case serves as a reminder of how little we still understand about consciousness and the human brain. Despite centuries of philosophical inquiry and decades of neuroscientific research, the relationship between awareness, intent, and behavior remains mysterious. The Falater case sits at the intersection of these mysteries, challenging our assumptions about responsibility and justice. It also illustrates the difficulty of achieving true justice in cases where the facts are clear but the interpretation is disputed. Everyone agreed that Scott Falater killed his wife. The question was whether he chose to do so or whether his actions were beyond his control. That question divided families, experts, and ultimately the jury that decided his fate. Today, as Scott serves his life sentence, he continues to maintain that he has no memory of killing Yarmila. Whether this represents genuine amnesia from a sleepwalking episode or a psychological defense mechanism to cope with guilt may never be known. The truth about what happened in the Falater backyard that January night remains locked away in the unconscious recesses of Scott's mind. The case reminds us that even in our modern world, with all our scientific knowledge and legal sophistication, some mysteries remain unsolved. The human mind retains secrets that resist our attempts to understand them, and justice sometimes must be dispensed despite incomplete knowledge. Perhaps that's the most unsettling aspect of the Yarmila Falater case. Not just that a loving wife and mother died so violently, but that we may never truly understand why. In a world where we expect explanations and clear narratives, some tragedies resist easy categorization. They exist in the gray areas between consciousness and unconsciousness, between choice and compulsion, between justice and mercy. The Falater family's story continues to unfold quietly, away from the media attention that once surrounded their case. Scott remains in prison. His children have grown up and started families of their own. And Yarmila rests in a Phoenix cemetery. The pool where she died has long since been filled in. But the questions her death raised continue to ripple through discussions of criminal justice, sleep research, and human consciousness. On quiet desert nights in Phoenix, when the palm trees cast their shadows and families settle into their evening routines, it's impossible not to think about how quickly and inexplicably tragedy can shatter the illusion of safety and normalcy. The Falater case serves as a somber reminder that sometimes the most dangerous threats come not from strangers in the darkness, but from the mysteries that lurk within our own minds. And in the end, that may be the most chilling aspect of this case. Not just that it happened, but that it could happen again. To any family on any quiet night when consciousness slips away and leaves behind only questions that may never be answered. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight we delve into a heartbreaking case from Des Moines, Iowa, that shook a community to its core in the summer of 2018. This is the story of 8-month-old Raja Strait, whose life was tragically cut short by the very person meant to protect her. Before we begin, please be aware that this story contains sensitive content involving the death of a child. While I'll present the facts with care and respect, listener discretion is advised. July 13th, 2018 began like any other summer day in Des Moines, Iowa. The temperature was climbing toward another hot, humid afternoon. Typical of the Midwest summer, families across the city were going about their routines. Parents heading to work, children enjoying their summer break, and caregivers tending to the youngest members of their families. In one Des Moines home, 8-month-old Raja Strait was in the care of her 17-year-old father, Jaden Strait. Raja was just beginning to explore the world around her in the way that babies do at 8 months old, perhaps starting to pull herself up, battling with increasing complexity, and developing the bright personality that would make her loss so devastating to those who loved her. The details of what transpired in those early hours of July 13th would later be pieced together through medical evidence, police investigation, and court proceedings. What we know for certain is that something went terribly wrong in that Des Moines home, setting in motion a chain of events that would forever change multiple lives. Jaden Strait was young, barely 17 years old himself. The responsibilities of parenthood at such a young age can be overwhelming under the best of circumstances. The sleepless nights, the constant care an infant requires, the financial pressures, and the fundamental life changes that come with becoming a parent are challenging for anyone. For a teenager, these challenges can feel insurmountable. But nothing, no stress, no frustration, no overwhelming circumstance could justify what happened to baby Raja on that summer day. The afternoon of July 13th took a dramatic turn when Jaden Strait rushed his unresponsive 8-month-old daughter to the hospital. Emergency medical personnel immediately recognized the severity of Raja's condition. The baby was in critical condition, fighting for her life. Hospital staff quickly began working to stabilize the infants, but what they discovered during their examination was deeply troubling. Medical professionals trained to recognize the signs of trauma could see that Raja's injuries were not consistent with accidental harm. The pattern and severity of her injuries raised immediate red flags. Doctor after doctor examined the baby, and their findings painted a horrifying picture. Raja had suffered multiple skull fractures, not the kind that might result from a simple fall or accident, but the type associated with severe trauma. Her small body bore additional injuries that spoke to a pattern of violence that medical experts would later describe as deliberate and sustained. As medical teams worked frantically to save Raja's life, hospital social workers and administrators began following protocol for suspected child abuse cases. Child Protective Services was contacted, and law enforcement was notified. The machinery of investigation began to turn, even as doctors continued their desperate efforts to help the baby girl. Throughout that long day and into the evening, medical staff did everything in their power to stabilize Raja. Her tiny body had endured trauma that would have been severe for an adult, let alone an 8-month-old infant. The medical team's notes from that day would later serve as crucial evidence in understanding exactly what had been done to this innocent child. Despite the heroic efforts of the medical staff, Raja's injuries were too severe. On July 14, 2018, just one day after being rushed to the hospital, 8-month-old Raja Strait died from her traumatic injuries. With Raja's death, what had been a suspected child abuse case immediately became a homicide investigation. Des Moines Police Department detectives began the careful and methodical work of determining exactly what had happened to the baby and who was responsible for her death. The medical examiner's autopsy would reveal the full extent of Raja's injuries, providing investigators with crucial evidence about what the baby had endured. The findings were devastating: multiple skull fractures, broken ribs, a ruptured spleen, and retinal hemorrhaging. Each injury told part of the story of violence inflicted on a helpless infant. Forensic pathologists determined that these injuries were not consistent with accidental trauma. The pattern of fractures, the severity of internal injuries, and the combination of wounds pointed to what medical experts would classify as non-accidental trauma. In other words, deliberate abuse. As detectives interviewed family members, friends, and anyone who had contact with Raja in the days leading up to her death, one fact became increasingly clear. The baby had been in the exclusive care of her father, Jaden Strait, when the fatal injuries occurred. The investigation revealed that Jaden had been the primary caregiver for Raja. On July 13th, according to the timeline investigators were able to construct, the baby had been fine earlier in the day, but something had happened while she was alone with her father. The window of time when the fatal injuries could have occurred narrowed to the hours when Jaden was her sole caregiver. Detectives also learned more about Jaden's background and circumstances. At just 17 years old, he was already facing the enormous responsibilities of parenthood. Friends and family members described him as sometimes struggling with the demands of caring for an infant. Some reported that he seemed overwhelmed by the constant attention Raja required. But being overwhelmed, stressed, or even frustrated does not explain or excuse the level of violence that had been inflicted on baby Raja. The evidence suggested a sustained attack on a helpless child, something that shocked even experienced investigators who had seen many tragic cases. On July 15, 2018, one day after Raja's death, Jaden Strait made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Rather than waiting for police to come for him, he turned himself in at the Des Moines Police Department. His surrender came just as investigators were preparing to obtain an arrest warrant based on the medical evidence in their investigation into Raja's death. By turning himself in, Jaden perhaps hoped to show some form of accountability for what had happened. though his actions could never undo the harm he had caused. At the police station, Jaden was formally charged with first-degree murder and child endangerment, resulting in death. The charges reflected the severity of what investigators believed he had done to his own daughter. First-degree murder indicated that prosecutors believed Jaden had acted with premeditation and intent to cause Raja's death. The booking process that followed was routine in its mechanics, but extraordinary in its implications. Jaden's mugshot was taken, his fingerprints were recorded, and he was processed into the Polk County Jail. At just 17 years old, he was facing charges that could result in life in prison. News of the arrest spread quickly through Des Moines. The idea that a teenage father had allegedly murdered his own infant daughter was shocking to a community already struggling to understand how such violence could be inflicted on someone so young and vulnerable. Local news outlets began covering the story, though details remained limited due to the ongoing investigation and Jaden's status as a minor at the time of the alleged crime. The basic facts were stark and disturbing enough. An 8-month-old baby was dead, and her teenage father was charged with her murder. As news of Raja's death spread through Des Moines, the community struggled to process the tragedy. The death of any child is devastating, but the circumstances surrounding Raja's death were particularly difficult for people to comprehend. How could a parent, someone entrusted with protecting and nurturing a child, become the source of such violence? On the evening of July 17, 2018, community members gathered near 10th and Clark Streets in Des Moines for a candlelight vigil in Raja's memory. Dozens of people came together in the warm summer evening, carrying candles and flowers to honor the baby girl whose life had been cut short. The vigil was a somber affair, with participants standing in quiet groups, some wiping away tears as they contemplated the senseless loss. Local residents who had never met Raja or her family came to pay their respects, united in their grief over the death of an innocent child. Among those gathered were other young mothers, some holding their own babies close as they tried to understand how anyone could harm such a vulnerable person. The vigil served as both a memorial for Raja and a collective expression of the community's shock and sadness. Speakers at the vigil talked about the need to protect children and support struggling parents before tragedies like this occur. They discussed the importance of mental health resources, parenting support programs, and community networks that might help prevent such devastating outcomes. But even as the community came together in grief, there were difficult questions that had no easy answers. How had the warning signs been missed? Were there opportunities for intervention that had been overlooked? Could anything have been done to save Raja's life? In the days following Jaden's arrest, his family found themselves in an almost impossible position. They were grieving the loss of baby Raja, while also grappling with the reality that Jaden, their son, grandson, and brother, was accused of causing her death. Carla Michael, Jaden's grandmother, spoke to local media about the family's devastation. "It's really sad because the baby is gone, Jaden is gone," she said, capturing the dual loss the family was experiencing. In her words, she had lost both her great-granddaughter and her grandson, one to death, the other to the justice system. The family maintained that Jaden would never have harmed Raja. Intentionally, they suggested that someone else might have been responsible for the baby's injuries, though they could provide no evidence to support this theory. Their comments reflected the difficulty of accepting that someone they loved could have committed such a horrific act. These statements from Jaden's family highlighted one of the most challenging aspects of cases involving family violence: the ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate victim and perpetrator. Extended family members, siblings, grandparents, and others close to both the victim and the accused must somehow process their grief, while reconciling their love for family members with the reality of what has occurred. For Carla Michael and other family members, accepting that Jaden had killed Radia would mean acknowledging that they had failed to see warning signs or prevent a tragedy. It would mean confronting the possibility that someone they thought they knew was capable of unthinkable violence. The psychological defense mechanism of denial is understandable, even when it conflicts with the evidence. But regardless of the family's statements or their understandable difficulty in accepting the charges against Jaden, the investigation continued. Medical evidence doesn't lie, and the injuries that killed Raja told their own story about what had happened in that Des Moines home. As the case against Raja Strait moved through the legal system, prosecutors faced several important decisions. The most significant was whether to try him as an adult or as a juvenile. Given that Jaden was 17 at the time of the alleged crime, This decision would have major implications for the potential penalties he could face. The severity of the charges and the nature of the evidence led prosecutors to seek to have Jaden tried as an adult. In October 2018, a judge ruled that despite Jaden's age at the time of the crime, he would indeed be tried as an adult for first-degree murder. This decision meant that if convicted, Jaden could face the same penalties as any adult defendant, including the possibility of life in prison. The ruling to try Jaden as an adult reflected the gravity of the charges against him, and the court's assessment that the crime was too serious to be handled in the juvenile justice system. By the time this decision was made, Jaden had already turned 18, further supporting the court's reasoning. As the case progressed toward trial, both the prosecution and defense began preparing their strategies. For prosecutors, the medical evidence was compelling. The autopsy results, expert testimony about the nature of Raja's injuries, and the timeline of events all pointed to Jaden's guilt. They would argue that the evidence clearly showed deliberate, sustained violence against a helpless infant. The defense, meanwhile, faced the challenging task of trying to create reasonable doubt in a case where the medical evidence seemed overwhelming. They would need to either present alternative explanations for Raja's injuries or argue that Jaden's actions, while harmful, did not constitute first-degree murder. Throughout this period, Jaden remained in custody, held without bond given the severity of the charges. The young man who had once been responsible for caring for his daughter was now confined to a jail cell, awaiting a trial that would determine the rest of his life. As the case moved toward resolution, the full extent of the evidence against Jaden became clearer. The medical examiner's findings were particularly damaging to any potential defense. The autopsy had revealed a pattern of injuries that medical experts said could only have resulted from deliberate violence. The multiple skull fractures were of particular significance. Forensic pathologists explained that the type and pattern of fractures Raja had suffered were not consistent with accidental trauma such as a fall. Instead, they indicated repeated forceful impacts to her head. The severity of these injuries alone would have been life-threatening. But Raja's skull fractures were not her only injuries. The broken ribs suggested that tremendous force had been applied to her small torso. A ruptured spleen indicated internal trauma that would have caused severe internal bleeding. The retinal hemorrhaging pointed to what medical experts described as shaken baby syndrome, violent shaking that can cause brain damage and death in infants. Taken together, these injuries painted a picture of sustained violence against baby Raja. Medical experts would testify that these were not the result of a single incident or moment of lost control, but rather indicated a pattern of abuse that had escalated to fatal levels. The timeline of events also worked against Jaden. Investigators had established that Raja had been fine earlier on July 13th, with no signs of serious injury. The fatal trauma had occurred during the window of time when she was in Jaden's exclusive care. No other potential perpetrator had access to the baby during the critical period when her fatal injuries were inflicted. Faced with this overwhelming medical and circumstantial evidence, Jaden's defense team likely advised him that his chances of acquittal at trial were minimal. The evidence was simply too strong and too clear to offer much hope of reasonable doubt. On November 8, 2019, more than a year after Raja's death, Jaden Strait made the decision that would seal his fate. Rather than proceed to trial, he chose to plead guilty to the charges against him. However, as part of a plea agreement with prosecutors, the charges were reduced from first-degree murder to second-degree murder and several related charges. The plea agreement indicated that while Jaden was accepting responsibility for causing Raja's death, prosecutors were acknowledging that the crime might not have involved the level of premeditation required for first-degree murder. Second-degree murder still carries severe penalties, but reflects a slightly different assessment of the defendant's intent and planning. In addition to second-degree murder, Jaden pleaded guilty to 3 counts of willful injury and 2 counts of child endangerment, resulting in serious injury. These additional charges reflected the pattern of abuse that medical evidence suggested had preceded Raja's death. Each charge carried its own potential sentence, which would be served consecutively rather than concurrently. The decision to accept a plea agreement rather than go to trial is never easy. But in Jaden's case, it may have been the only realistic option. The medical evidence against him was overwhelming, and the likelihood of conviction at trial was extremely high. By pleading guilty, he avoided the uncertainty of a jury trial, while potentially receiving a somewhat less severe sentence than he might have faced if convicted of first-degree murder. For Raja's extended family and the community, the guilty plea provided a measure of closure. There would be no lengthy trial, no detailed testimony about the extent of the baby's suffering, and no possibility that Jaden might somehow be acquitted despite the evidence. His admission of guilt validated what investigators had concluded and medical experts had determined. On November 8, 2019, Raja Strait stood before a judge in Polk County District Court to receive his sentence. The young man who had once held his infant daughter in his arms now faced the consequences of taking her life. Judge Scott Rosenberg sentenced Jaden to the maximum penalty allowed under the law for each of the charges to which he had pleaded guilty. For the second-degree murder conviction, he received 50 years in prison. For the 3 counts of willful injury, he received an additional 10 years each. For the 2 counts of child endangerment, he received another 10 years for each count. Most significantly, the judge ordered that all sentences be served consecutively rather than concurrently. This meant that instead of serving multiple sentences at the same time, Jaden would have to complete one sentence before beginning the next. The total 100 years in prison. At just 19 years old at the time of sentencing, Jaden faced the reality that he would likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. The 100-year sentence effectively ensured that he would die in prison, paying the ultimate price for the ultimate crime, the murder of his own child. The sentence reflected the court's assessment of the severity of Jaden's actions and the need for both punishment and protection of society. Judge Rosenberg's decision to impose consecutive sentences, rather than concurrent ones, demonstrated the court's view that each act of violence against Raja deserved separate consequences. For the community that had grieved for baby Raja, the sentence provided a sense that justice had been served. The man who had taken an innocent life would spend his own life paying for that crime, while nothing could bring Raja back or undo the suffering she had endured. The sentence ensured that Jaden would be held fully accountable for his actions. As the legal proceedings concluded, and Jaden began his life sentence, the broader questions raised by Raja's death remained. How does a 17-year-old father become capable of such violence against his own child? What warning signs might have been missed? Could this tragedy have been prevented? The case highlights the vulnerabilities that can arise when very young people become parents before they are emotionally or psychologically prepared for the enormous responsibilities involved. The sleepless nights, financial pressures, and constant demands of caring for an infant can be overwhelming for anyone, but may be particularly challenging for teenagers who are still developing emotionally themselves. Research shows that very young parents face higher rates of stress, depression, and other mental health challenges that can impact their ability to provide safe, nurturing care for their children. Social support, parenting education, mental health services, and other interventions can help young parents develop the skills and resources they need to care for their children safely. But even acknowledging these risk factors, Jaden's actions remain inexplicable and inexcusable. Millions of young parents face stress and challenges without ever harming their children. The vast majority find ways to cope with difficulties, seek help when needed, and provide loving care even under difficult circumstances. What separated Jaden from other young parents who struggle but never harm their children remains unclear. Perhaps there were underlying mental health issues that went unrecognized or untreated. Perhaps there were warning signs that family members or others missed or dismissed. Perhaps the combination of stress, immaturity, and other factors created a perfect storm that led to tragedy. As we reflect on this tragic case, it's important to remember that at its center was an innocent victim whose life was cut short before it truly began. 8-month-old Raja Strait never had the chance to take her first steps, speak her first words, or experience the joys and discoveries that should have been part of her childhood. Raja's short life ended before she could develop relationships, pursue interests, or contribute to the world in whatever way she might have chosen. The potential that every child represents, the possibility of future achievements, relationships, and experiences, was extinguished by the very person who should have protected and nurtured her. The community vigil held for Raja in those first days after her death demonstrated that even though her life was brief, she was mourned by people who had never met her but recognized the tragedy of her loss. The flowers, candles, and tears at that gathering represented a collective acknowledgement that every child's life has value, regardless of how short it may be. For those who did know Raja, family members, friends who had held her or watched her grow during her 8 months of life, the loss was even more profound. They remembered not just the tragedy of her death, but also the joy of her presence, however brief it had been. The investigation and legal proceedings focused necessarily on determining what had happened to Raja and who was responsible. But beyond the medical evidence, witness testimony, and legal arguments was a simpler truth. A baby who should have been loved and protected was instead harmed by the person who should have been her greatest advocate. The murder of Raja Strait created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. Family members, friends, investigators, medical personnel, lawyers, and community members all carried pieces of this story with them, long after the legal proceedings concluded. For the medical personnel who treated Raja in her final hours, the case represented one of the most difficult aspects of their profession, trying to save a child who has been deliberately harmed by a parent. Doctors, nurses, and other healthcare workers entered their fields to help people, but cases like Raja's forced them to confront the reality that sometimes they cannot save everyone, particularly when the injuries are too severe. The investigators and prosecutors who worked on the case carried their own burden. While they successfully built a case that led to Jaden's conviction, the victory was hollow. Their success meant justice for Raja, but it could not undo the harm that had been done or bring her back to life. For Jaden's extended family members, the case created a complex web of grief, guilt, and conflicted loyalties. They lost Raja to violence and Jaden to his own actions. And the justice system, some may have wondered whether they could have done something to prevent the tragedy if they had recognized warning signs or intervened in some way. The case also affected the broader community's sense of safety and security. Child abuse cases, particularly those involving very young victims, shake people's assumptions about the world and force them to confront uncomfortable realities about violence against children. The fact that the perpetrator was so young himself added another layer of complexity to these reactions. While nothing can undo what happened to Raja Strait, her death offers important lessons about child protection, support for young parents, and the warning signs that might indicate a child is at risk of harm. Research consistently shows that very young parents face higher risks for child abuse and neglect, not because they are inherently more violent or less caring, but because they often lack the resources, support systems, and developed coping skills that can help parents manage stress and difficulties. Programs that provide support, education, and resources to young parents can help reduce these risks. Early intervention services, including home visiting programs, parenting education classes, mental health services, and social support networks, have been shown to reduce rates of child abuse and neglect. These programs work best when they are voluntary, non-judgmental, and focused on building parents' strengths rather than simply identifying problems. Healthcare providers, teachers, family members, and others who interact with young families also play crucial roles in identifying children who may be at risk and connecting families with resources and support. Training in recognizing signs of abuse, understanding risk factors, and knowing how to report concerns appropriately can help protect vulnerable children. But prevention efforts must be balanced with the recognition that even the best programs and services cannot eliminate all risks. Some individuals, for reasons that may never be fully understood, make choices that result in tragedy despite having access to support and resources. Today, Jaden Strait remains incarcerated, serving his 100-year sentence in an Iowa prison. At 26 years old as of 2024, he faces the reality of spending the rest of his life behind bars for the murder of his infant daughter. The young man who once held Raja in his arms and was responsible for her care now lives with the knowledge that he was the cause of her death. The prison system where Jaden is housed provides basic necessities: food, shelter, medical care, and safety. But his life is fundamentally constrained by the consequences of his actions. He may participate in educational programs, work assignments, or other activities available to long-term inmates. But his future is defined by the walls of his cell and the reality that he will never again be free. Whether Jaden experiences remorse for his actions, whether he has gained insight into what led him to commit such violence, whether he thinks about Raja and the life she might have lived, these are questions that only he can answer. The legal system held him accountable for his crime, but the internal reckoning with what he did is a burden he must carry alone. The house where Raja died, the hospital where medical personnel tried to save her life, the courthouse where Jaden was sentenced, these places have returned to their normal routines. But for those who remember, these locations will always be connected to the tragedy of a baby's death and a young man's fall from troubled teenager to convicted murderer. The community of Des Moines has moved on, as communities do after tragedies. Other crimes have occurred, other stories have captured attention. Other families have faced their own struggles and triumphs. But the memory of 8-month-old Raja Strait and the senseless violence that ended her life remains a part of the community's collective memory. As we conclude this difficult story, It's important to end not with the violence that took Raja's life, but with the recognition of what her brief existence meant. For 8 months, Raja Strait was a living, breathing person who deserved love, protection, and the chance to grow and develop like any other child. Though her life was tragically short, Raja was more than just a victim of crime. She was a baby who likely smiled and laughed, who may have been beginning to respond to familiar voices, who was starting to explore the world around her with the curiosity that defines early childhood. These aspects of her life, though brief, were real and meaningful. The vigil held in Raja's memory, with community members gathering to honor her life, demonstrated that even those who never knew her recognized her worth and mourned her loss. The flowers, candles, and tears shared that evening were acknowledgments that every child's life has value, regardless of how short it may be. In cases like this, there is often a tendency to focus on the perpetrator, the legal proceedings, and the quest for answers about how such tragedies occur. While these aspects are important for understanding and prevention, they should not overshadow the central truth. An innocent child lost her life to violence, and that loss matters. Raja's story serves as a reminder of the vulnerability of children and the absolute responsibility adults have to protect them. It underscores the importance of supporting struggling parents before problems escalate to violence, and it highlights the need for communities to remain vigilant in protecting their most vulnerable members. Most importantly, Raja's story reminds us that behind every statistic about child abuse, every news report about violence against children, and every legal case involving harm to minors is a real person whose life mattered. 8-month-old Raja Strait deserved better than the life she received, and her memory calls us to do better in protecting other children who depend on adults for their safety and well-being. In the quiet moments before sleep, as we reflect on this tragic story, perhaps we can find a way to honor Raja's memory by committing ourselves to protecting the children in our own lives and communities. Though we cannot undo what happened to her, we can work to ensure that her death was not entirely without meaning, if it inspires us to be better guardians of those who cannot protect themselves. The candles lit at Raja's vigil have long since been extinguished, but the light of memory continues to burn for a baby whose life, though brief, touched the hearts of many who never knew her but recognized the tragedy of her loss. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. In the affluent town of New Canaan, Connecticut, where manicured lawns stretch between colonial houses and the morning routine flows as predictably as clockwork, Jennifer Dulos began what would be her final ordinary day. It was Friday, May 24th, 2019, and like countless mornings before, she prepared her 5 children for school, a ritual that had become both routine and precious in the midst of an increasingly bitter divorce battle. Jennifer, 50 years old, was not just any suburban mother. She was a woman of substance, a graduate of Brown University with a master's degree from New York University, someone who had built a life of purpose around her children and her writing. Her friends described her as meticulous, devoted, and perhaps most importantly in the context of what was to come, deeply protective of her family. That morning, as she drove her children to their respective schools, Jennifer couldn't have known she was being watched. She couldn't have known that the familiar streets of her neighborhood would soon become the center of one of Connecticut's most perplexing missing person cases. The last confirmed sighting of Jennifer Dulos was at 8:05 a.m., when surveillance cameras captured her black 2017 Chevrolet Suburban leaving her children's school. What happened in the 2 hours and 20 minutes that followed would become the subject of intense investigation, courtroom drama, and ultimately tragedy that would ripple through multiple families and an entire community. To understand the events of that May morning, we must first understand the relationship that had brought Jennifer to this point. Her story with Fotis Dulos had begun like many love stories, with promise, attraction, and dreams of a shared future. They had met years earlier, and Fotis, the charismatic entrepreneur from Greece, had seemed like everything Jennifer might want in a partner. He was handsome, successful in the luxury home construction business, and shared her appreciation for the finer things in life. Their early years together were marked by prosperity and growing family. They settled in Farmington, Connecticut, where Fotis's company 4 Group was developing high-end properties. 5 children followed, 2 daughters and 3 sons who became the center of Jennifer's world. For a time it seemed they had built the perfect American dream: successful careers, beautiful children, and the financial resources to provide them with every opportunity. But beneath this polished surface, cracks were beginning to show. Those close to Jennifer began to notice changes in her demeanor, subtle signs that all was not well in the Dulos household. Friends would later testify that Jennifer had become increasingly anxious, more withdrawn, and had begun expressing concerns about her husband's behavior. The confident, accomplished woman they had known seemed to be shrinking into herself. The first public indication that the Dulos marriage was in trouble came in June 2017, when Jennifer filed for divorce. But this wasn't a simple dissolution of a relationship that had run its course. Jennifer's filing painted a picture of a woman who feared for her safety. In court documents, she stated that she believed Fotis would retaliate by trying to harm me in some way. These weren't the words of someone seeking an amicable separation. These were the words of someone who felt genuinely threatened. The divorce proceedings revealed the extent of the couple's financial troubles. Despite their outward appearance of wealth, Fotis' business empire was crumbling. For a group owed millions to various creditors, and the stress of mounting debt was taking its toll. Jennifer, who had family money, found herself increasingly controlling the finances, a situation that only added to the tension between them. As the legal battle intensified, so did the personal animosity. Fotis was required to move out of the family home, but the custody arrangements meant that the former couple remained entangled in each other's lives. Jennifer had been granted temporary custody of the children, but Fotis was fighting for equal time. Each exchange, each communication, each court hearing became another opportunity for conflict. It was during this period of separation that Fotis began a relationship with Michelle Troconis, a woman who would become central to the events that followed. Michelle was educated, attractive, and worked as a marketing consultant. She was also from Venezuela, and like Fotis, was navigating life as an immigrant in America. Their relationship began while Fotis was still legally married to Jennifer, a fact that would later complicate everything that followed. Michelle was not merely a romantic distraction for Fotis. She became deeply involved in his life, his business, and inevitably his conflicts with Jennifer. Friends and family members would later describe how Michelle seemed to support and even encourage Fotis' increasingly hostile attitude toward his estranged wife. What might have started as a relationship between two adults became something more complex and potentially dangerous. The morning of May 24th, 2019, began routinely enough. Jennifer's last known activities were captured by various surveillance systems throughout New Canaan. She was seen dropping off her children, just as she had done hundreds of times before. Her vehicle was recorded traveling back toward her home on Wells Lane, a beautiful property where she was living alone since Fotis had moved out. What happened next can only be reconstructed through evidence, forensics, and the painstaking work of investigators who would spend months piecing together a puzzle with crucial pieces missing. At approximately 10:25 a.m., Jennifer's phone went silent. Her last known location, according to cell phone data, was in the vicinity of her home. When she failed to appear for appointments later that day, friends became concerned. Jennifer was not someone who simply disappeared without explanation. She was responsible, reliable, and deeply committed to her children's schedules. Her absence was immediately alarming to anyone who knew her well. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came when Jennifer failed to pick up her children from school. This was not something she would ever do voluntarily. When evening arrived and she still hadn't appeared, friends contacted the police, and a missing person investigation was launched. What police discovered at Jennifer's home would turn a missing person case into something far more sinister. While there was no obvious sign of struggle visible to the casual observer, forensic analysis told a different story. Blood evidence was found in the garage, evidence that someone had attempted to clean up what investigators believed was a crime scene. The garage showed signs of recent cleaning with industrial-strength products, but traces of blood remained, invisible to the naked eye but detectable with proper forensic techniques. Even more telling was what was missing from the scene. Jennifer's 2017 Chevrolet Suburban was gone, and it wouldn't be found abandoned in a nearby park until several days later. When investigators processed the vehicle, they discovered additional evidence of violence. Blood spatter patterns that suggested Jennifer had been injured while inside the vehicle. Meanwhile, as police were beginning their investigation, Fotis Dulos and Michelle Troconis were captured on surveillance cameras engaged in highly suspicious behavior. On the evening of Jennifer's disappearance, the couple was recorded making multiple stops along Albany Avenue in Hartford, approximately an hour's drive from New Canaan. The surveillance footage showed them stopping at various locations, gas stations, apartment complexes, anywhere there was a dumpster or trash receptacle. At each stop, either Fotis or Michelle would exit their vehicle carrying what appeared to be garbage bags or other items, which they would deposit in the trash. To investigators, this behavior was highly unusual and extremely suspicious. Why would two people drive an hour from their home to dispose of ordinary household garbage? The answer, investigators believed, was that what they were disposing of was far from ordinary. Acting quickly, police managed to retrieve many of the discarded items before they could be collected by sanitation workers. What they found was shocking and incriminating. Among the discarded materials were items of clothing stained with what appeared to be blood. Items that seemed to match Jennifer's size and style. More disturbingly, investigators found cleaning supplies, zip ties, and other materials that suggested a violent crime had taken place. The evidence recovered from those Hartford dumpsters became crucial to building a case against both Fotis Dulos and Michelle Troconis. But it also raised disturbing questions about premeditation and the involvement of multiple parties in whatever had happened to Jennifer. As the investigation expanded, a clearer picture began to emerge of the events of May 24th. Investigators theorized that Fotis had waited for Jennifer to return home from the school run, attacked her in her own garage, and then transported her body in her own vehicle. The timeline suggested that this had all occurred within a window of just a few hours, but those hours had been carefully planned and executed. The forensic evidence painted a picture of violence and calculated cleanup. Blood spatter analysis suggested that Jennifer had been attacked with some kind of weapon, possibly a hammer or similar blunt object. The attempts to clean the scene were extensive but not entirely successful, leaving behind microscopic traces that told their own story of what had occurred. But perhaps most chilling of all was the timeline that investigators constructed. Based on cell phone data, surveillance footage, and other evidence, they determined that Fotis had not acted alone. The coordination required to carry out the attack, dispose of evidence, and create alibis suggested a conspiracy involving multiple people. Michelle Troconis became a central figure in this conspiracy theory. Investigators believed that she had not only known about Fotis's plans, but had actively participated in the cover-up. Her presence during the evidence disposal, her changing statements to police, and her apparent attempts to create alibis all pointed to someone who was deeply involved in the crime. The third person to be charged in connection with Jennifer's disappearance was Kent Mawhinney, a friend of Fotis and his former attorney in a civil case. Mawhinney was alleged to have helped with planning and logistics, though his exact role remained somewhat unclear. His involvement suggested that the conspiracy extended beyond just the romantic relationship between Fotis and Michelle. As the legal case developed, more disturbing details emerged about the relationship between Fotis and Jennifer in the months leading up to her disappearance. Court documents from their divorce proceedings revealed a pattern of increasingly aggressive behavior from Fotis. Jennifer had expressed fear not just for her own safety, but for the safety of her children. Friends and family members testified that Jennifer had become increasingly isolated and fearful. She had installed security systems, varied her routines, and taken other precautions that suggested she believed she was in genuine danger. In hindsight, these precautions seemed tragically inadequate. The investigation into Jennifer's disappearance consumed enormous resources. Search teams combed through forests, fields, and waterways throughout Connecticut. Cadaver dogs were brought in, aerial searches were conducted, and investigators followed up on hundreds of tips from the public. Despite these extensive efforts, Jennifer's body was never found. This absence of a body became both a challenge for prosecutors and a source of ongoing anguish for Jennifer's family and friends. Without physical remains, they were left with questions about exactly what had happened to her and where she might be. The legal definition of murder could still be met without a body, but the emotional closure that comes with being able to lay someone to rest remained elusive. The legal proceedings against the three defendants stretched over several years and were marked by dramatic developments. Raja Strait, who had been the primary target of the investigation, died by suicide in January 2020. Just days after being charged with murder, his death came after an apparent suicide attempt that left him hospitalized and ultimately ended his life. Fotis's death meant that he would never face trial for Jennifer's murder, leaving many questions unanswered. It also complicated the cases against Michelle Troconis and Kent Mawhinney, as the prosecution could no longer rely on the possibility that Fotis might testify or provide information about the other defendants' roles in the crime. Michelle Troconis' case proceeded to trial, and the evidence presented painted a picture of someone who was deeply involved in the conspiracy to murder Jennifer Dulos. Prosecutors argued that Michelle had not only known about Fotis's plans, but had actively helped to carry them out. The evidence included her participation in the disposal of evidence, her changing statements to police, and what prosecutors characterized as attempts to create false alibis. The trial revealed additional disturbing details about the relationship dynamics involved in the case. Testimony suggested that Michelle had been aware of the deteriorating relationship between Fotis and Jennifer, and had actively encouraged Fotis's hostility toward his estranged wife. Text messages and other communications showed a woman who seemed to view Jennifer as an obstacle to her own happiness with Fotis. Throughout the trial, Michelle maintained her innocence, with her defense team arguing that she had been manipulated and deceived by Fotis. They portrayed her as someone who had trusted the wrong person and found herself entangled in a situation she had never intended to be part of. The defense acknowledged that Michelle's behavior after Jennifer's disappearance had been suspicious, but argued that this was the result of fear and confusion rather than guilty knowledge. The jury ultimately rejected this defense, finding Michelle guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, tampering with evidence, and hindering prosecution. The conviction carried a potential sentence of up to 50 years in prison, reflecting the serious nature of the charges and the role that prosecutors believed she had played in Jennifer's death. Michelle Troconis was ultimately sentenced to 20 years in prison, a punishment that reflected the court's view of her culpability in the crime. The sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for Jennifer's family and friends to address the court and express the impact that her death had had on their lives. The case of Kent Mulwiney remained pending, with his role in the conspiracy still being litigated. His alleged involvement demonstrated the complex web of relationships and planning that investigators believed had gone into Jennifer's murder. The fact that the conspiracy involved multiple people suggested a level of premeditation and coordination that made the crime even more disturbing. The impact of Jennifer's disappearance and presumed murder extended far beyond the immediate parties involved. Her 5 children, who had lost their mother and effectively lost their father as well, faced a future of profound loss and disruption. The extended families on both sides struggled with grief, anger, and the complex emotions that arise when someone they loved becomes either victim or perpetrator in such a terrible crime. The case also had broader implications for domestic violence awareness and prevention. Jennifer's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers that can arise during contentious divorce proceedings, particularly when significant assets and child custody are at stake. Her death prompted legislative action in Connecticut, including the passage of Jennifer's Law, which expanded the legal definition of domestic violence to include coercive control. The investigation itself became a model for how modern law enforcement can use technology and forensic science to build cases, even in the absence of direct witnesses or a victim's body. The extensive use of surveillance footage, cell phone data, and forensic evidence demonstrated how thorough modern police work can reconstruct events and identify perpetrators even when they believe they have covered their tracks. For the investigators who worked on the case, the absence of Jennifer's body remained a source of professional frustration and personal anguish. Despite extensive searches and following up on numerous tips, they were never able to provide Jennifer's family with the closure that comes from being able to recover and properly bury their loved one. The question of what exactly happened to Jennifer's remains continues to haunt everyone involved in the case. The story of Jennifer Dulos is ultimately a story about the failure of systems designed to protect people in vulnerable situations. Despite her awareness of the danger she faced, despite her attempts to seek help through the legal system, despite her efforts to protect herself and her children, Jennifer was unable to escape the violence that ultimately claimed her life. It is also a story about the complexity of human relationships, and the devastating consequences that can result when love turns to obsession, when financial pressure combines with personal animosity, and when multiple people become involved in planning and covering up violent crimes. The aftermath of Jennifer's disappearance continued to reverberate through the community of New Canaan and beyond. Her death served as a stark reminder that domestic violence can affect anyone, regardless of social status, education, or apparent resources. The fact that someone with Jennifer's advantages, financial resources, education, social connections, and legal representation, could still fall victim to such violence was sobering for advocates and observers alike. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerabilities that can arise during divorce proceedings, especially when children and significant assets are involved. The combination of personal animosity, financial pressure, and disputes over child custody can create a volatile situation that requires careful management by legal professionals and sometimes intervention by law enforcement. For the children involved, the loss of their mother and the criminal proceedings against their father and his girlfriend created a traumatic situation that would require years of healing and support. The impact on children of domestic violence extends far beyond the immediate incident, affecting their sense of security, their ability to trust, and their understanding of relationships for years to come. The extensive media coverage of the case also raised questions about privacy, sensationalism, and the balance between public interest and family privacy during times of crisis. While the attention helped maintain focus on the investigation and may have generated useful tips, it also created additional stress for family members who were trying to process their grief while living under intense scrutiny. As time passed and the legal proceedings concluded, the question of what exactly happened to Jennifer's remains continued to haunt everyone involved. Despite offers of leniency in exchange for information about the location of her body, none of the defendants provided information that led to recovery of her remains. This ongoing mystery meant that Jennifer's family continued to live with uncertainty and were unable to achieve the closure that might come with being able to properly bury their loved one. The case became part of true crime folklore, inspiring books, television programs, and countless discussions among people fascinated by the psychology of domestic violence and murder. However, for those who knew and loved Jennifer, she remained not a character in a true crime story, but a real person whose life had been cut short and whose absence created a permanent hole in their lives. The story of Jennifer Dulos serves as a reminder that behind every true crime case are real people whose lives have been forever altered by violence. While we may be drawn to these stories for their mystery, their psychology, or their legal complexity, we must never lose sight of the human cost and the real families who continue to live with the consequences long after the headlines fade and the legal proceedings conclude. In the quiet moments, when the noise of investigation and trial and media coverage dies down, what remains is a family missing their mother, children growing up without their guidance, and a community grappling with the reality that even in their safe, affluent neighborhoods, terrible things can happen to good people. The case stands as both a testament to the dedication of law enforcement professionals who work tirelessly to seek justice for victims, and a sobering reminder of the limitations of our ability to prevent domestic violence even when warning signs are present and resources are available. Jennifer Dulos was more than the victim in a sensational crime story. She was a mother, a daughter, a friend, and a woman who tried to protect herself and her children from a dangerous situation. Her story continues to resonate because it represents the experiences of countless other women who face similar dangers, most of whom will never receive the attention that her case generated. As we reflect on Jennifer's story, we are reminded of the importance of taking domestic violence seriously, of believing victims when they express fear, and of working as a society to create better systems for protecting vulnerable people. Her death was a tragedy that might have been prevented, and her legacy should include a commitment to doing better for others who find themselves in similar situations. In the end, the case of Jennifer Dulos remains a mystery in some respects. While we know that she was murdered, while we know who was responsible, while we know many of the details of how the crime was carried out and covered up, we still don't know exactly where she is. That unknown continues to represent the unfinished nature of this story and the ongoing pain of those who loved her. Perhaps that is fitting in a way. Jennifer's story doesn't have a neat ending because real life rarely does. The impact of her death continues to ripple through the lives of those who knew her, through changes in law and policy, and through the countless other women who see in her story a reflection of their own fears and vulnerabilities. The case reminds us that justice is not always complete, that some questions remain unanswered, and that the most important thing we can do is remember the person behind the headlines and work to prevent such tragedies from happening to others. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.